Hello and welcome back to the Metroball Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. The System Gateway Review series continues. We're on chapter 6 of 7. We're talking about the final runner cards within System Gateway today. Those are the shaper cards. We have 9 to go through today, and I think 2 of the last neutral runner cards. If you don't know how the series works, we're going to be going through all of the shaper cards, talking a bit about their lore and flavor, but also, of course, how they play in a game of Netrunner and what sort of decks and strategies they work well within. Now, of course, there's a lot of viewers who might be new to Netrunner and are enjoying, hopefully, System Gateway. So we'll be talking about these cards specifically within that limited System Gateway meta. But it's important to understand that these cards are a legal part of the standard Netrunner meta, which is the 4 or 5 years of the last Netrunner releases. This is what the majority of competitive play takes place within. So we'll be addressing that section as well. We're got a lot of cards to go through. These things take a minute or so. So there is timestamps in the YouTube time bar if you want to jump to a certain card. So be it. And of course, if you like this sort of content, feel free, please give a like or subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow. So today we're going to be talking about shaper cards. And a good place to start, just like we have been for most of the series, is to talk about what shaper is by definition. And the folks at Nisei have written a really short blurb to describe who the shaper runners are. And let's just give it a read. It says, shapers run. They don't run for money. They don't run for change. They run because they can. They run for fame, for notoriety, for fun. They run because, to them, it's the purest form of self-expression. It's a challenge to tinker together the perfect program, to find the most efficient solution to their problems. Though it may take some time for them to find the correct solution, once they do, they can crack any server. The contents of the server don't matter. All that matters is the run. And that's fantastic. The shaper faction is actually one that I think I would struggle with to describe what it is they do or why they do it. All the factions in Netrunner are divided not by who they are, but why they're doing the thing that they are doing. And Anarchs are running for a change in the world. Criminals are running for self-interest, for profit. And shapers run because running is an art. Running is fun. It's just on its own a satisfying thing. That's actually really interesting. It's pretty, there's a lot of very fun characters that show up within the shaper card pool. It's also important to know how shapers play just like fundamentally on the table. And compared to some of the criminals and anarchs you might have seen that are very aggressive, classically shapers were actually the opposite of that. They kind of held the control side, as they call it in a lot of card games, where they would kind of set up slowly and build this on this like eventual presence in which they have an incredible board state of all this program and hardwares and resources. And at the late game, they'd be able to deal with just about anything once they're fully set up. And so Kate McCaffrey is kind of pushes you towards that direction. She was the original shaper identity, giving you that reduction in cost on the first thing, program or hardware you install each turn. So a lot of times you find these kind of like these engines that would slowly build up. They would spend a lot of time installing expensive things. Maybe eventually a magnum opus would hit the table in the original core sets. They would print out money very slowly and methodically and continue building this immense board state. And this is just wildly different than some of the other stuff we see. And shaper, a lot of the ways that shaper play today still kind of respect that sort of economy value over time proposition. Cards like Professional Contacts are still like pretty integral within a lot of shaper game plans. And this is a very slow and heavy card that you would install in the early game, but then reap the value of it as the game goes on. It's also like a pretty good, I have an example. The most expensive card in Netrunner, period, was a shaper console at one point in time, a 2-story tall computer within the professor's basement. And I just want to show this because it's a very big difference to then the original core set criminal, Gabriel Santiago, who said, run HQ, every turn run, interact, go get accesses, go get value, things like Desperado. I'm going to pay you to do this thing. You just go in and get runs, get accesses. And shaper was more about, I'm going to set up, I'm going to sit back, and eventually we'll build something quite impressive. You see that still modernly in the card pool. Things like, well, this is not in the standard card pool, but the idea that the late game inevitability study guide becomes the best decoder over a long enough period of time and a long enough investment. And modernly, things like Hushuk is a strong multi-axis card that is only a threat in the mid to late game, where the runners have installed a fair bit of things on their side of the table. And installing things and this sort of value is like a very present thing. Shapers kind of embody the same sort of HB efficiency value. We've talked about Hasboroid being the one corporation that cared about efficiency, and Haley is kind of an HB identity in some ways. Asa Group is the modern Haley in the card pool. But Haley has been a quintessentially one of the most competitive shapers. Just the ability to install multiple things a turn just helps you so much, when a lot of the shaper card pool involves setting up and installing a lot of things. If you do it nearly twice as fast, you get there a lot quicker. But that's kind of interesting. We have a lot of this like shaper install and setting up stuff, but it's also important to know that shaper embodies some of the strangest identities and the most interesting identities, I could call them, I guess. Things like Kit Peddler, Riel, they say the first ice that they encounter every turn, it's a code gate. And so now the breaker suite becomes entirely different. How corps set up and how they ice up things and how they build is entirely different. And maybe the professor is just an absolute head scratcher. You only have one influence. That's not going to be good for you, but it says the first copy of each program in this deck does not count towards your influence limit. So you end up with this like wild arrangement of all these ridiculous singleton programs, like you're playing some sort of EDH commander magic deck. It's fun. It's weird. It's wacky. And then the Seer, I think, embodies it the best. Our Cyber Explorer has an ability that is just absolutely absurd. And the way that you build around this might not be obvious. And a lot of this is about, you have to utilize your cards intelligently and understand paidability windows and some of the like minute structures of how turns work in Netrunner, just to be able to use your money maybe before you instantly lose it. And that sort of stuff might sound dry. Maybe that sounds boring, understanding paidability windows and the exact timing structure of runs. But for a lot of people, that is interesting for a technical card game like this. But it's actually something that's really important to Shaper inherently. And that's because Shaper, outside of System Gateway is actually a pretty big departure from this. If I had to describe one card to identify what Shaper looks like modernly, and as for the last, what are we at now? Like 7 years? It's self-modifying code. This is a zero-cost program you put on the table, and for 2 credits at instant speed during any paidability window in the game, this can become any program in your deck. And 2 credits is a premium, but the ability to get something out when you need it is very quintessentially Shaper. We talked about the idea that these tinkerers can find the right program for the job, and having access to be able to pull things mid-run is what people, I'm afraid we're going to have to go a bit blue here, but a lot of times people call this Shaper bullshit. The idea that a shaper looks like they don't have an answer and suddenly a self-modifying code pops and it pulls a program which interacts with another program and pulls another thing out. And there's so many cards in the shaper card pool that give you this flexibility to really produce anything out of anywhere. Out of thin air, something shows up that solves your problems. And you have cards like self-modifying code, you have cards like Simulchip that pulls things from the heap. Da Vinci was really wacky and fun. You get some cool kickflips out of here. You have cards like Artist Colony, which allow you to throw or to bring anything out of your deck. And Cabinessa Wu as well. Programs come out of nowhere, but they might not last too long. And this is really cool. There's so many ways in Shaper to be able to creatively flex your muscle, to have this toolbox of toys you can play with and you pull them out. And it has a big impact on what Shaper deck lists look like. This is Aesop's Haley as a world's runner-up back in 2017. But the deck structure of this deck might look radically different than anything else you've seen before if you've been playing mostly Criminal or Anarch or System Gateway. There's a lot of one-ofs. There's a lot of interesting singleton cards that are sometimes they're tech cards. They're not necessary in every matchup. But the way that Shapers can play with cards like Self-Modifying Code is that they can choose to get access to these cards when they need them and if they need them. And allows you to build this sort of flexible thing. The Icebreaker suite here is wild too. There's like so much overlap, and finding the best option for the problem ahead is like the Shaper thing. This is really cool to watch somebody who's really good at it play. It's kind of magical. On top of that, we talked about how Shaper has the best tools. They're also pretty well known for having really niche solutions to some of the most difficult problems. This is Deus Ex. Any amount of net damage, no thanks. Some of the scariest ice, no, we'll break it for free. Sharpshooter. Again, archers, not a problem. Anything that wants to hurt you, you can deal with it cheaply. And this just gets more interesting and more strange. The Devas, this will break only ice that has 3 or more subtypes. So it has to say something like Codegate, Observer, Tracer. And that might be pretty limited, but why not have another program that just gives things subtypes? You see the kind of game we're playing here? Or how about one of the best Codegate breakers in the game, except it can only work on a single server? Or Admin. Admin is an AI breaker that can break subroutines for pennies, but only interacts at a certain specific strength. This is so cool. And this is like fundamentally what Shaper is. I've had the, I'm going to say pleasure of playing so many Shaper decks this last month and absolutely just making a pig's ear out of it on stream. This is the sort of deck. It's a Cabinessa Wu deck, and How the combo works in theory is you want to install cards like Euler, and the turn that they get installed, they break code gate subroutines for free for the turn that they're installed. And you're installing them with Cyber Trooper Tau loot, so they get additional strength. So they're coming at high strength, breaking things for free. And once you've got through enough things on a turn, maybe you're using Brahmin, an AI breaker that as an additional cost puts that card back on top of your deck. I forgot to mention that I don't know, anything we've installed, we've also installed it on Flameout. So we're using these credits for free as long as we can get rid of the card before the Flameout burns it out. And then once Brahmin takes that program and puts them back on top of your deck, you have Prognostic Hue Loop, which you can pay a credit to install the card that you just put on top of your deck. And you can do it on the corporation's turn to get extra value from your DZMZ Optimizer. There's just so much going on here. And while, again, I'm going to really struggle playing this deck when I need to in a public space, it speaks so much to so many people who want to play this sort of combo decks, who want to be able to figure out these problems and build these ridiculous engines with so many moving parts that once you get them up to speed, oh man, they work with efficiency like nothing else. And that's like a stark contrast. These are the 9 Shaper cards within System Gateway, and they're very simple. I don't think any of them care specifically about interactions when it comes to the timing windows. There's no like instant speed things you have to worry about. They're very straightforward. And if you notice in like the starting System Gateway runner deck, Shaper cards show up pretty consistently, I think only after criminal cards. And once you go over to the more advanced upgraded starter runner deck from System Gateway, you'll notice it's mostly Shaper and criminal cards. And it's actually Anarch cards that have very little representation, and they kind of show off as more like a combo deck that requires more synergies internally to be coherent. That's a pretty big difference between what Shaper looks like outside the System Gateway. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think System Gateway needs to be simple and approachable, but it's just a very different Shaper than some things we're used to, which is really cool. But these cards are good. I think the last thing I want to talk about, and just this for basic understanding, is Shapers. Just like every faction classically back to the core set put pressure on a certain central server, Shapers would put pressure on R&D. They had cards like R&D interface that said, if you let me into R&D, I'm going to see more and more cards. We even had a card called indexing at one point in time that was just the strongest R&D pressure that you could ask for. And just turn 1, this comes down for 0 credits. So Shapers targeting R&D, that's still a thing that is alive and well in System Gateway. That's what Shapers are. We got 9 Shaper cards to go through today, and you still do see that sort of magic. You still see a lot of those sort of things in it. It's a bit, I think, more approachable. Nobody's going to ask you to pilot this as your first Welcome to Netrunner game, but you'll get there eventually. And I hope you have fun once you do get there, because it's wild. So our Shaper identity is Tau Salonga Telepresence Magician. Comes in as a natural identity, 40 minimum deck size, like everything in System Gateway, has 15 influence. And his ability reads, whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, you may swap 2 installed pieces of ice. And the flavor text reads, sufficient skill is indistinguishable from magic. Man, this is such a cool identity. Let's just start with the name Tau Salonga. Now, I'm not entirely sure at this point. I don't have the Nisei release documents, and they usually talk a bit about where the names come from. Tao itself, or Dao, is generally a Chinese name. When it comes to things like Taoism, this shows up a lot. The word Tao signifying the way, the path, the route, the road. This might be a stretch again, like the Tao here does technically have an accent on it, so I might be entirely off, but that's where I'm looking at right now. And Salonga is traced back to the very prestigious names.org website as a Filipino name. And according to this user submitted meaning, Salonga is an indigenous surname meaning in the cave, which honestly could make sense here, whether that was done on purpose. We have somebody who is a telepresence magician, somebody who from one place can control things from another place. So maybe the path in the cave makes some sense. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch. If you want more about Tao, RC wrote this, Serenity wrote a pretty good article. These articles came up on the Nisei blog during release or during spoilers weeks. And this one's really cool. You hear Tao meeting with another character and having this mutual agreement of he'll help him if he helps him out. So we talked a bit about telepresence. Telepresence is a complicated word for a pretty simple idea, I suppose. Technologies that will allow a person to feel as if they were present, to give the appearance of being present or have an effect to be in another location. And while that can be things like virtual reality, it is as simple as, Zoom, which you might be very familiar with as of this or last year. And Tao actually works a lot with that sort of thing, projecting himself to be as in another place and manipulating things. And if you look at the Tao art, he's wearing this sort of like suit. This is referred to a lot of times or in other times on the cards as a Waldo, otherwise a remote manipulator. It's It's basically a mech suit that Tau can control either presumably with his mind. The name Waldo coming from the 1942 short story Waldo by Robert A. Heinlein, another name that shows up actually a heck of a lot, specifically in System Gateway. And that is Tau Salonga. Oh, yeah, actually, lastly, there's the quote there at the bottom. Sufficient skill is indistinguishable from magic, which is just such a lovely play on the old Arthur C. Clarke quote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Arthur C. Clarke, mind you, being a famous scientist and science writer. And this sort of idea of shaper tricks being magic or looking like magic is fantastic. And that magic subtype or that magic kind of idea shows up in a bunch of other shaper cards. We had a whole set of stealth breakers like Houdini or Davy and a Canadian magician, the original professor. This is alive and well within the shaper card pool. So this is Tau. Tau's ability, whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, swap 2 installed pieces of ice. This is the ability that I was the most excited to play when it was revealed in System Gateway. It's such a fun ability and reminds very clearly of an old Criminal Identity, which just rotated. And this is Leela Patel. Basically the same setup. Whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, you could add 1 unresed card to HQ. And Leela was a menace. She's been absolutely such a menace since the day she came out. I think a lot of people are excited that she's no longer within the standard card pool. And the idea is that Leela and Tau represent disruption. The idea is that if you have some plans, no matter what as the corp, well, not no matter, there's some corps that don't want to score agendas, but generally agendas are going to be in the game. And when you score them or when they're stolen, something disruptive is going to happen to you. And Tau's disruption is actually very interesting. It's harder to deal with a lot of Tau's disruption than it is with Leela. I'm not going to go talking too much about what Leela did, but the idea with Leela is you could return a card to hand. And as a corp, if a card was returned to hand, yeah, it's a bummer. Sometimes it's a huge liability when your securities fall apart, but you can still spend a click to reinstall that card, a click and a credit. That's a real cost if it is, deeper on the server. But Tau, repositioning ice is not something a corp can fix at all. Within System Gateway, if I'm not mistaken, there's no way to fix the repositioning of ice. And that's where Tau's ability becomes really, really, really disruptive. And it's important to understand not all ice is made equally. And a good corp is going to make some very big considerations of where ice goes. And they want to put the ice in the best place for that piece of ice. This is Pharos, and Pharos is like the upper end of what ice looks like in System Gateway. This eventually can be 10 strength. And this is a really good piece of ice to put maybe on your scoring remote. This is on your scoring remote. You feel pretty safe jamming agendas behind there or putting anything behind there. And it's very hard for the runner to think, oh, is that an asset? Oh, is that an agenda? It's really expensive for you to check. So maybe they'll ignore the remote server and try and win off central servers. Maybe they'll run R&D or HQ, which are likely to be cheaper. That's the idea of big ice like this. You put it somewhere, build a wall, build a defense, and do something good behind it. But then there's other ice within System Gateway, things like Tithe. And Tithe is not very good on a remote server where you want to score agendas because the runner doesn't need to break Tithe. You can always go through this for free, take a net damage, give the corporate credit. And so this is the sort of ice I'd more likely in some games just put on HQ in the early game or R&D in the early game, just to make it so it looks like it's defended and it's a bit more annoying. Again, when the runner runs R&D, they're not guaranteed to get an agenda. So generally the ice can be a bit less strong as the remote server where there's going to be a lot of times where it's 100% an agenda. So having some better ice there is important. And Tau can change that. Say you were silly enough in the Tau matchup to put a Tithe on HQ and it's rezzed and Tau knows what it is. And then there's a Pharos on a remote server. Tau can say, okay, I'm going to swap that. An agenda was scored or stolen. Now the Pharos is on HQ. Maybe Tau's not going to run HQ anymore. But how are you going to score out behind a Tithe in the remote server? This is really cool. There's so many situations where there's like big ice in your deck and little ice in your deck, and having control of where that goes makes it very difficult to score out in a remote server. Maybe a Brawn is what you wanted to score on your remote server. And then you also have some pings, which were rezzed early. And then the mid to late game, Tau is going through this for 1 credit. So what about if I put those pings on R&D now suddenly, and I can run R&D for credits as opposed to getting through a Brawn or the remote server. Even within System Gateway, you have cards like Palisade, and Palisade on their own, technically, it's better to put this on the central server than it is the remote server. It saves you a fair bit of money. And Tau has that ability to control where the ice goes. And that's incredibly disruptive. It's hard for the corp to fix that, and it's hard for the corp to have a scoring game plan behind a remote server that's a tithe to a ping. Admittedly, now maybe HQ is really protected with Pharos into brand, but that's the idea, right? So Tau's ability can be additionally disruptive because of the ways that corps will try and score agendas. A lot of the times with the 5-3 agenda, things like send a message, you'll go install advance perhaps, and the next turn you do advance, and you'll score it out. Now you've scored an agenda with no clicks left. This is a perfect time for Tau to do something awful, and then you as a corp can interact with it. The idea that Tau can now suddenly swap that Pharos off of R&D that might have been there, and then go in for a jailbreak. This is quite scary. These sort of 1-2 punches were the quintessential Leela plays, and Tau has access to that. The idea that you can play for a turn ahead. You can think, okay, the corp is going to score that agenda, which is okay because by doing that, they will open up their defenses, and or I will kind of open up their defenses, and then you have access to some attacks. And that's really cool. Say as a corporation, you just finished scoring out your longevity serum. Now, perhaps worst case scenario, you understand that there's a certain piece of ice that you might have de-resed, and you know the corp can't afford to res it. Maybe you swap that onto R&D, so now there's an ice they can't res because they went down to low credit scoring at their agenda. Maybe it's even just a white space, a code gate you can get through for 1 credit in certain board states, and then you just slam a conduit and go. And then on top of that, this actually snowballs on itself. Say you run R&D, you pay 4 credits to get through some ice, you score an agenda, and then suddenly you can swap some more ice and make it cheaper. As if maybe the corporation doesn't have a lot of money, you can go ahead and put an unresed ice, a de-resed ice, an ice they can't afford to res on R&D, and then go in and get more accesses. And this snowballs out of control pretty quickly. The conduit can put in a lot of work in this matchup. And I find myself in Tau decks to try, a lot of times I'll try and I would definitely put Conduit in there, and we'll talk about this in a second. But I'll try and put in the sort of breakers that allow me to get through things cheaply. Things like Buzzsaw get through almost all the code gates within System Gateway for a penny, 1 or 2 credits. Cleaver is also really good at dealing with some of the barriers, gets through most barriers for a credit. It's fantastic. And the idea is with these sort of cards, you have windows to position the ice that you can cheaply break on the servers that you want to attack. And this works doubly well with things like Botulus. Botulus is a really strong card in System Gateway. If you put Botulus on a piece of ice, a lot of the times that's just a dead ice. But now with Tau, you can control where that ice is that you break for free. So suddenly the corp scores that Botulus ice that was on the remote server now is on R&D, and you can start smashing R&D for free. Maybe build up those conduit tokens and get more pressure. Same goes for Tranquilizer, which is really nice for if you know that ice is de-res and you know the corp can't res it, moving around the de-res dice, which the corp doesn't want to re-res because it has a Tranquilizer on it, is really good fun. Now, one of the most important things as a corporation when you're playing against Tau, and again, I think there's a high skill cap of playing Tau just because every time, like you can play for the 1 or 2 turns down the line. You can play that I'm waiting for the corporation to score an agenda, hopefully with no clicks left, and then I can move something around and capitalize on a play. Like that is really cool. But as a corp, you also have to understand how to play because it's very easy to play poorly against Tau, and Tau can capitalize on that. So a big thing in Tau is that you need to make sure which servers you're icing and which servers you're not icing. A lot of times against basically any other runner within System Gateway, if I don't need to protect HQ too heavily, I'll put something small onto HQ, something that I res cheaply, that is just annoying enough that the runner's not running in for free. And things like Tithe are a really good example. This is a great piece of ice that I'll put on HQ. But as soon as I do that in the Tau matchup, I have to now play the game understanding that that Tithe is going to end up eventually on my remote server, or that Tithe is going to end up eventually on R&D when they're conduit digging me to death. So a lot of times in these matchups, I will only ice the servers that I think are necessary to be iced. And a lot of times within System Gateway, that's only your scoring remote and R&D. And then hopefully you can just make sure there's not enough agendas in HQ by playing cards like Sprint or Spin Doctor. That's really important, so you're not flooding up. But I promise you, one of the best things you can do against that Tau matchup is just not ice up servers in which you have to understand that maybe in 4 or 5 turns, whatever server you iced up thinking, oh, this is just good enough of defense for right now, that is going to be where your biggest ice is, and your Tithe is going to end up on the remote server, and it's really hard to win from that board state. So do keep in mind when you're playing against Tau what you need to ice up and what you don't need to ice up. It's actually very different than playing against somebody like than Zaya or playing against Lu, who put on stronger central pressure on every single central server. It's very, very different. And for that reason, when I'm playing or building Tau decks, I'm actually very interested to play cards that put pressure on servers that I'm kind of like goading the corporation to ice up. Say maybe I put down a red team, maybe I put down a leech, something like that. The corp might be more interested in putting some amount of defenses on HQ. So I'm not getting free leech counters and free credits. And at that point, that's generally good for you, because now you have another piece of ice that you can move around. You have a place where you can position their strongest ice and not care. Oh my God, if they ice up archives, are you in a good spot where you end up putting their Pharaohs on archives? It's going to be a problem for them. And that's Tau. We talked about Tau, or we talked about Shapers being more about setting up and building a presence, and I'm really excited to see Tau, whose ability is a bit more interactive. And I think you can still play this in two ways. You can play a very aggressive Tau that's trying to get some early accesses, disrupt the corp so their strong ice is not where they thought it was, and that might slow them down. Like you can play a very aggressive Tau. But on top of that, you actually can play a control game. That's sort of like Shaper control, where you're setting up for a couple turns down the line and you know, okay, once the corp scores, I'll be able to reposition stuff and have maybe a window. That's also really cool too, that there's some flexibility how this is played. I don't think you have to go so aggressively. I think you could play and sit back and play a bit, but it's really cool no matter what you do it. And I love these sort of like interaction heavy runners. Specifically, there's a lot of ways to play this. Anytime something is scored, you usually have a couple options, and it's really interesting to see the better players figuring out the best options. Now, outside of System Gateway, Tau is actually kind of interesting. It's worth noting, I guess. We didn't talk about this when we talked about Shaper, but this sort of ability to reposition ice is something that has existed in the Shaper card pool. There's been a couple cards that do this. And Inversificator is a decoder that lets you move code gates that you've broken all subroutines on. I think, what is it, first time a turn? And Inversificator for a long time in competitive standard Netrunner was banned or restricted. I think it was just restricted, right? And that is because this was a very strong effect. And a lot of times you see decks that would run cheap code gates, and suddenly their cheap code gates would end up on their scoring remote and their good ice would end up on archives. And it was really hard to play around. And for that reason, this was a restricted card. Admittedly, that might have been a strange restriction. I think a lot of people saw that and been like, oh, that's weird. I don't think that card's that strong, but it remained restricted for a really long time. So there is a precedent, at least classically, that this sort of effect can be incredibly strong and disruptive. Admittedly, Inversificator on its own is like an okay decoder, so that's attached to something else, but Tau has more flexibility and less flexibility in some ways. And you know, that same sort of idea that not all ice are made equally does exist within in the standard card pool, right? So you have cards like Engram Flush that are pretty ubiquitous in a lot of decks. This will end up on central servers. And you have cards like Slot Machine, same idea, an annoying taxing ice on central servers. And then maybe on the remote server, you have something bigger like an Anansi. And the idea is that Tau, you have the ability to disrupt this. You have the ability to put that Anansi on HQ, and suddenly that Engram Flush is on the remote server, and that might make things easier for you. But I think the problem that I'm running into a lot of the times is this is a very different meta than System Gateway. And this is something we've been talking about every time we do review videos. Right now, a lot of the ice in Netrunner is way better than what some of the designers think it should be. I think that's what's been talked about publicly. So you'll notice cards like Engram Flush or Slot Machine, even if they're on the remote server, that's still a lot harder to deal with than a Tithe. So the ability to like entirely invalidate a server by just putting their worst ice on the server doesn't line up as well as it does within System Gateway. Engram Flush is still really annoying. That being said, there's some really cool interactions within outside of System Gateway. Cards like Border Control are pretty ubiquitous, and this card really cares about where it is. The best place, to get a Border Control is on a remote server with a lot of other ice. And you have cards like Afshar that wants to go on HQ. If you take this off HQ, it's a lot worse. Cards like Surveyor that care about how deep the server is. You put a Surveyor with one ice on it on archives. Oh my God, is it terrible? And on top of that, you even have, some positional ice. I'm not a big fan of Rhyme, but if you put a Rhyme literally anywhere else than it wants to be, oh my God, is it awful? So there is a precedent, or at least there is some interest in why cards like Border Control, Afshar, Surveyor, Rhyme. Like there are cards within the standard card pool that admittedly saw a lot more play maybe 6 months ago than they are doing now in some cases. But there's some good reasons why disruption could be valued. Now, the thing I like doing, and this is something you can do in the standard card pool that you can't within System Gateway, is whenever I'm building a Tau deck, I want to, again, the same idea, force people to ice up servers that they don't need to ice up, just so I have a bit more options of where to put things that they might not want them there. And I find myself playing cards like Diversion of Funds. For 5 influence, I'll play this in a Tau deck. Surprise, out of nowhere, the Shaper steals 5 credits from you, and it's a mixture of putting pressure on servers they might not have expected. But again, one of the best things you can do with Tau is repositioning ice when the corp can't res the ice. That's the idea, is the corp scores an agenda, maybe they don't have a lot of credits, you put unresed ice on R&D, and now they can't res the ice, and then you can get a bunch of accesses for free. There's a bunch of other cool tricks you can play with this. Things like emergency shutdown. You run HQ, de-res something suddenly. Oh my God, now I need to ice up HQ, and your options get a bit wider. Things like forge activation orders, even sneak door beta. These can be a lot of fun. Now, there are also other things you can pair this with to get that sort of additional value. Boomerang is a really nice card. Sometimes your boomerangs hang out on ice that the corp doesn't want to res. Being able to reposition it can be nice. All these criminal tricks work well together. And Deuce is Wild. Sometimes getting information about what the ice is gives you better ideas of where to move them. And you also have interesting things. Cards like Cubon are really cool. If the corp can res ice, you can move that ice to somewhere where you actually get to credit. You get a profit when you're going through it. And Turning Wheel is actually kind of fascinating. Turning Wheel is a kind of a mid to late game card. You build up these tokens and then eventually cash them in for big digs. But the important thing about Turning Wheel is that to get Turning Wheel counters, the run doesn't have to be successful. So you can go out of your way and put something that just ends the run on the outermost of R&D or HQ, something like a funhouse. You get that on the outermost of R&D and HQ. Now you can just spend time bumping into it and just getting those Turning Wheel counters. And that's interesting because it's hard for a corp to fix that problem without over-installing or attaching more ice onto those servers. And when it comes to multi-axis, having things like Turning Wheel and having things like even Hushuk maybe, or with the Maker's Eye, that's actually kind of valuable. Because Tau's ability fires when agenda is stolen as well. There are some turns where you think, okay, I need to run into the remote server, so I want to make sure that I can run maybe R&D this turn and steal an agenda so that I can move some ice around and then get into the remote server. These sort of like 1-2 punches are really fun, and we've seen them a lot when it comes to old Leela decks. And Leela decks would favor things like the Maker's Eye, and of course the Conduit is what we want to play with right now. But that's really important sometimes. If you need to make your ability, if some turns you just, I need an ability, I need to be able to steal an agenda this turn. Cards like Hushuk, Maker's Eye, they can help you get there. There's also some interesting things when it comes to ice positionality. Again, you have interesting breakers. Gordian Blade is really good if you can stack all the code gates in a row. That's fun. You have cards like Mass Driver, which are a bit silly, but you could technically set up some situations where this is better than it's ever been. Wow. And then things like Euler and Gauss are really cool when it comes to positioning ice in certain positions, so you can get the most value out of it. And of course, Ngolo, a really strong decoder in the modern meta. This has some strengths and some weaknesses. If it needs to deal with 2 sentries in a row, that can be a problem. So the idea is with Tau, you can ensure that the Ngolo's paint and kick ability never finds itself caught in a position that it can't deal with. Also, Apocalypse. Tau can Apocalypse pretty easily. Again, if you can just get those border controls off the central servers, you can build some good remotes and then make the centrals all nice and weak, and you can blow the board out. And this is happening a fair bit. This is happening a fair bit in the meta. I think you're just going to see Shaper decks Apocalypsing people. Apocalypse is really strong right now, but it's another good reason to play Tau. The fact that you can control where the ice goes makes it a lot easier to pull off some of these like powerful plays. Now, the one thing, again, while Tau has a really interesting ability and potentially a really strong ability, I don't know if it's always going to be relevant. And this is kind of the problem. You have to see what sort of decks you're playing against. Because this is like, we talk about this deck a heck of a lot, but I think this is just a good description of what some of the modern decks look right now. This is a very fast precision design in the standard meta card pool. And decks like this, like they're only running good ice. Just about all the ice in this deck is pretty good. And moving its positionality around doesn't change too much, barring maybe the border control or putting the macrophage somewhere awkward when they don't want to res it before they score out of sandbox. But it won't change that much unless you're at some situations where it's just like, oh, I don't have a fractor, but I have a decoder. So maybe I'll put the code gate on the server that I want to run this turn. So it's not perfect. Maybe against some of the acid matchups, it does very little, but against some of the decks that care more about the positionality, decks like this a lot of times don't put that much ice on each remote server. It might not matter too much. Perhaps it does slow them down where you think, okay, now the remote server after they scored is now just 2 code gates. So I can deal that with 1 program. That can help you a bit. Oh my God. Also, it is worth mentioning. You ever play against Thimblerig? Thimblerig just kind of ignores your whole text ability. And it's happened just about every time we play Tau publicly. You find a Thimblerig. And that's it. Yeah, it's rough. I don't know what to do about this. I think you have to de-res this and just never run it again, which is not a really great strategy. But that's Tau in standard. Again, I think it's so cool to have abilities that are more interactive and interesting when it comes to Shaper, because we've seen a lot of Shaper decks that are just like setup stuff, things that are, I would say, a bit dry, like having an extra MU. That's neat, but like I want to make more decisions when I play, and I like that a lot more. That's more interactive and has a lot of flexibility of how you can play it. In System Gateway, I think it's really fun. I think as a corporation, you have to figure out how to play against it because it's very easy to make mistakes that Tau can capitalize on. Our next card is a Shaper event. It's called Creative Commission. It costs 1 credit. It's an event. It says gain 5 credits. If you have any clicks remaining, lose a click. The flavor text says the challenge in my art is what I live for, but I'm not going to say no to a patron with taste. Cost 2 influence. And this is the first of 2 cards that kind of are thematically very similar. These sort of things that really encourage you to play them last click. We have Creative Commission, and next we have VRcation. So we'll be talking about these 2 together. I love this art. This art is really nice and fun and colorful. And this sort of like 3D cyber, what is it? It's like a mandala. It's actually really fascinating. I'm a big fan of this. So this is a pretty simple card. For 1 credit, you gain 5. So 4 credits in net. And we've seen that before. This is Sure Gamble. We talked about this before. One of the most popular Netrunner cards across the runner decks. This is such a quintessential card. 1 click for 4 credits. You can't ask for a lot better than this. And one of the big differences between Sure Gamble and Creative Commission is Sure Gamble costs 5 to play, which 1 is a smaller asking price. Admittedly, though, Creative Commission has a bit more restrictions. It wants you to play it at the end of your turn. And this is something that is the recurring theme that you're going to see more within System Gateway when it comes to describing Shaper. And that is the sort of thoughtful planning. I like this a lot. A lot of the Shaper cards kind of give you these like mini goals to do. As a new player experience, I think it's fascinating. It really telegraphs what the deck expects you to do. You have a lot of things that are like, okay, I want to play this last click. I want to click this once a turn. I want to install one thing a turn. And these all work in a really interesting way, tugging you in different directions, but they're also coaxing you or encouraging you to do the thing that is the most efficient. Creative Commission, you generally want to play a last click, which gives you a lot of flexibility to spend your first couple turns installing things going on low credits and then suddenly, boom, bursting up with Creative Commission. The same thing goes for running. The idea is that you can start smashing into a corp server, and then suddenly you spend maybe a couple credits, maybe a couple too many credits breaking some ice, and then boom, you're back up to 5. And again, being back up to 5 is also sick because we talked about Sure Gamble being at 5. So now you can recover from low credits really easy. Creative Commission to Sure Gamble. This is so good. And it is worth noting that you can choose to not play this last click. Basically, you could play this first click and you'll end up spending 2 clicks for 4 credits. That's not as efficient as 1 click for 4 credits. In fact, it's twice as bad. But there are some circumstances in which that's correct. Maybe you know this turn, I need some money and then I need to run this remote server a couple times. Sometimes that's the right play. It's Creative Commission, first click, run. Admittedly, it's not going to happen as often, but there are some times where that will be correct. Now, the thing that is the most stunning about a card as simple as this is that this is so wild for the Shaper card pool. This is a deck called 2014 called It Wants Its Deck Back. And San made a deck that's very reminiscent of how the competitive Shaper decks looked back in 2014. And if you look at the events here, you notice there's very little economy tied into events. Sure Gambles, sure, and then 3 stim hacks. This doesn't exist anymore, and that's it. All the other economy is attached to resources and other things you can do. If you look at the Time of Maven, Giles' deck list that came out earlier this year, mind you, before System Gateway, look at the event package. 3 Sure Gambles, 2 stim hacks, that's it. Again, all the economy is attached into some resources. It's cards like Professional Contacts, a very expensive early game card that sets you up. Cards like Aesop's Pawn Shop that trades in those many cards you install throughout the game, or cards like Technical Writer. So much of the Shaper economy for the last 7 years has been attached to this slow play of resources building up and getting this efficiency over time. If you look at the Shaper event pool, these are all the Shaper events. Mind you, a lot of these have rotated. None of these just give you money in a very straightforward way. There's always like a bunch of, it's all multi-axis or like some recursion or interesting, strange things, but very few of them just say, here's some money, here's some value. Spec work, mind you, an Issei card is the closest to it and it requires you to trash something. And that's why Creative Commission is wild. This is unfounded. We've never seen a Shaper Econ card like this. And if you see throughout System Gateway, like every faction has something like this. I guess Criminal is a bit harder, huh? But like every faction has access to a deck that can just play an event-based economy, and Shapers classically couldn't. And this is the beginning. This is such a huge change for Shaper decks that now Shapers could consider running decks that just play event-based economy, as opposed to playing the sort of resource-based packages they've been playing for a really long time. That's awesome. That's so cool. You no longer need to play those sort of slow Shaper games, the sort of Haley decks that double install every turn just to have something to trade to the Aesop's pawn shop. Maybe now cards like Akiko Nisei, cards that are more aggressive, that want to run more, that don't want to set up as much as some of their kin, can get more value. And I think that's just so cool. Now on its own, it's a really good card. Even without any of the history or understanding how different this is than everything else we have, it is a very good card. It is the 4th, 5th, and 6th Sure Gamble in your deck that sometimes is even easier to play than Sure Gamble. Sometimes you get to low credits and it's hard to get to the Sure Gamble threshold, and this can help you out. And I think that's awesome. It is worth noting, in System Gateway though, we also do have Wildcat Strike, which is another Sure Gamble 4, 5, 6 in your deck. And admittedly, while this looks like it gives a choice to the Corp, 99% the Corp should or will just give you those 6 credits. So if I'm building a non-Shaper deck, I feel like a lot of times I'd rather put a Wildcat Strike on it because it is less influence. But within Shaper at least, and sometimes outside of Shaper in System Gateway, this is fantastic for a way to just get more consistent economy in your deck that is very easy to play. Running last click technically is something you shouldn't be doing. I don't think it's as bad as in System Gateway as it was in some of the old core sets. So like just having a card that encourages you to sit back and chill is fantastic. Now, outside of System Gateway, I don't think I have too much else to say that I haven't before, besides the fact that this is fantastic. And all the Shaper decks that we've been used to building for the last decade, that's not technically true, are all resource-based, and we can now maybe do something a bit more aggressive. Onacom was a Shaper console that came out in Ashes, or in Uprising, one of the last Nisei sets. And when this card came out, Nisei even wrote, like, well, this card might be strange, because there's not a lot of events within Shaper modernly. There's going to be more card support to come to help out that archetype. And Creative Commission is fantastic with Onacom. Admittedly, maybe playing Creative Commission last click isn't the best time to draw a card, but these sort of engines might work out quite well. And you have cards like Prepaid Voice Pad back in the modern card pool, the standard card pool, so you can play your Creative Commission as 1 click for 5 credits. Mystica Miami lets you play those events even cheaper, and heck, maybe even you can run at low credit levels and play an algo trading deck. This is technically value, right? It's fantastic. It's such a cool breath of fresh air. And I think this is a really big card when it comes to changing what Shaper can get away with. And I'm really excited to see if the Shaper decks are going to look a lot or a little different than they would before. This is a very easy way to push them in that right direction. And a very similar card to this, but I think one that I'm less excited about, is VRcation. Very similar idea of a lot of similar numbers too. This is 1 credit to influence for this event. And it says draw 4 cards. If you have any clicks remaining, lose a click. It says, you know, there's no water in the Sea of Tranquility, right? It doesn't mean there's no beach. Oh, but is this a reference to Tranquility Home Grid? I'm not sure what Tranquility Home Grid is, but it says Tranquility in capitals, so I'm assuming it might be. Now, this is a very similar idea. If you play this last click, you don't lose a click, so it's either 1 click for 4. If you want to play it earlier in your turn, it's 2 clicks for 4. And admittedly, drawing cards is something you want to do at the beginning of your turn, just because it gives you the most options. And again, if you do this at the end of your turn, you might have too many cards in your hand, so you have to discard cards. So this one's a bit more tricky. I think it's a lot easier to take credits at the end of your turn. Admittedly, too, to some extent, you want credits at the beginning of your turn with Creative Commission to do things, but I feel like that's a lot easier to handle. There's more cards in your deck that will give you economy. But VRcation feels a bit more awkward because you want to draw earlier in the turn. Now, firstly, we talked about this every time we see a card in System Gateway that says the word draw cards on it, is that there is not a lot of options within System Gateway. These are all the cards that can draw you cards in System Gateway. Now, if you're playing Shaper, you're not playing Lou. Wildcat Strike shouldn't be drawing you cards consistently. So kind of all you got is VRcation, Jailbreak, and Verbal Plasticity. And Verbal Plasticity is a 2 of in just about every Gateway deck I've played so far on the basis that you need the card draw. So VRcation is just fantastic within System Gateway because you need that card draw. In any Shaper deck, I'll gladly play 3 of these. This usually ends up as a 2 of in most other decks that I'm playing. Card draw is very important. And a 2 influence for some pretty good card draw, you'll take that within System Gateway. Now, we talked a bit about how it's awkward to discard cards if you're playing this last click. You're generally gonna have to discard some cards, and I just want to emphasize that's not the worst thing. Discarding cards, a lot of times you can imagine those are cards that you weren't going to draw in the matchup. Unless it's a weird matchup in which you need every single card in your deck because they're doing some sort of net damage to you, which is not going to really happen in System Gateway. You can feel pretty comfortable discarding cards. If you draw into a Telework Contract you don't need, just bin it. Like, it's okay. Just imagine what's on the bottom of your deck and you're never going to draw it. And you still presently even have better information on what you're going to draw next because your deck is thinner. So I just want to emphasize that can sound scary. There's a lot of games where you want to get all the value you can from all your cards, but if you just need a breaker now, hit the VRcation, go find your decoder. That's really good. So don't get too wrapped up about trying to keep every card. So VRcation and Glass Click and binning some cards, it's fine. Because the idea is not to play every card, but it's to get to the cards that you need in the matchup. It's also worth noting that there is ways to increase your hand size that makes VRcation more playable or more easily playable to get the maximum value. I don't think that's totally necessary, let alone in Shaper. T400 doesn't seem as good as some of the in-faction memory that we'll be talking about, but that is an option as well as if you are very averse to throwing things out. It's also a card I find playing a lot in Lou decks. Carnivore is a pretty card-hungry card, and having additional ways to burst draw to be able to feed the Carnivore is pretty valuable. But that's VRcation in System Gateway. Yeah, card draw is really important. It really is quite important, and I'll play this. I think it's less exciting than Creative Commission because we have seen other card draw cards like this. There's more Shaper card draw cards, I think, than like Shaper economy cards on events. So this is less exciting to me, but it's definitely pretty valuable, specifically within System Gateway. Also, a big shout out to Diviner, who wants to hit odd cards, and Creative Commission VRcation generally hang out in hand for a long time. So this is a pretty good way to hunt those out as a corp. Now, outside of System Gateway in the standard card pool, Diesel is the closest thing we have to this, and Diesel has been pretty standard within Shaper decks. It's a very explosive card. 0 for draw 3. It's pretty good. A big part of Diesel too, that the way that it showed up in a lot of old Shaper decks was not for the draw exactly in the mid to late game, but more to help them in the early game to be sure that they're going to draw the very expensive cards that they need to set up. The idea is that I'll Diesel to find my professional contacts and then start using professional contacts to draw cards. And that technically isn't, I guess VRcation still helps you, but it's a bit more clumsy because you're not opening your turn with it, you're ending your turn. It's also worth noting that there is a combat sometimes within your deck between playing VRcation and Creative Commission because they're both competing for that last click slot every turn. But I don't think that's that big of a deal where you wouldn't consider playing both in the same deck. Now, burst cards like VRcation, Career Fair, Diesel. Those are good if you're installing a lot of things a turn. I mentioned Career Fair for that reason. One of the easiest ways to play VRcation is if you install a bunch of things. You open your turn by playing 2 cards out of your hand, Career Fair, install a resource, maybe install something, play something, and then last click your VRcation to draw back up. So it technically feeds into those play patterns of like install, run, draw 4. And that's good. It keeps you going. It also, again, works with things like Onicom, which again is pretty difficult when you're drawing 5 last click. That feels pretty clumsy. I think you could consider playing it in things like Anarch, where you actually don't mind discarding some breakers. Maybe you can play bin breakers within Shaper. Sometimes that does happen, specifically with Paperclip. I feel like in Anarch, that's not amazing when you have access to things like moshing anyways, which have a similar idea. If you don't mind throwing things out, you'll get there faster and make money at the same time. So it's honestly an interesting card. I think as a burst draw card, you'll definitely see it within Shaper, especially Shapers that might want to move away from some of their resource engines and want to just play events to get through their deck. And I think it's really cool for that faction. But I'd be really surprised to see this outside of faction just because Criminal and Anarch do already have enough draw built in. It is also worth knowing, again, you don't have to play this last click. Sometimes you want some cards because in standard, you're running into things like Obokata Protocol, and that's nice and well. But I think sometimes you'd wish you steal the Obokata Protocol and then miss hitting the VRcation in hand, but that's kind of the dream. And then you draw back up and recover, but that's quite difficult. You can't assume that's going to happen. Our next card is a piece of hardware. This is DZMZ Optimizer. I think that's the only way that's correct to say. It's a piece of hardware. It gives you +1 MU. Mind you, you start with 4 memory units. That's what you use to install programs. It gives you an additional memory unit, lets you install more programs. I don't know if it said it costs 2. It says the first program you install each turn costs a credit less to install. And the flavor says Tau exhaled, the med exoskeleton faithfully stabilizing him. In that absent breath, you reach through layers of Waldos and optimizers and pluck that errant molecule from the chip. That's awesome. And those are the sort of suits and the arms that Tau controls. Apparently, they even reach down to the molecular level, which is pretty wild. Now, I don't actually know what this name stands for. Oh, I know we do. We do know what this name stands for. I forgot about this. This is actually meant to be like an acronym of some of the Nisei designers, if I'm not mistaken. It was like David Zoe. Dang, I gotta look this up. This was hinted at. Oh, I totally forgot about this. I opened up this, which is not right. DZMZ is like a Filipino, is it? I think it is a radio station. That doesn't exist anymore. So that's definitely not. This is an acronym or abbreviation of some of the Nisei designers. I'll try and figure out who that is again. Morgan, I believe is the M. Yeah, we'll figure it out. This is the Optimizer. It is a card that gives you extra MU, which is nice. That is something that's interesting, especially for decks, shaper decks that might want to install a lot of programs, and it makes those things cheaper. We've seen cards like this. There's a lot of cards in Netrunner that are just things that you install that give you 1 credit of additional value a turn. Cyberfeeder doesn't exist anymore, but it goes back from the core set. And this is kind of like a version of old Kate as well. Lets you get that cheap install and program once per turn. That's really nice to see. The idea with DZMZ Optimizer, it's actually a bit different than it might look. A lot of times you might think I'm only going to install an MU hardware when I need additional MU, because in the early game, you have 4 MU to work with. But DZMZ actually kind of works opposite of that. You want to get this down in the early game, because if you're going to install a lot of programs throughout the game, this actually gives you credits. So you want to get this down kind of early, which is pretty wild, because paying 2 credits for 1 MU in the early game doesn't feel awesome a lot of the time. So hopefully you're installing a lot of things to get that money back over time. And that actually works really well. We're going to talk about the shaper programs, but the shaper programs specifically want you to install a lot of other icebreakers. So getting down those echelons early, you get those down for cheaper. Things like Mayfly come in for free, which is really fun. And you have a lot of other programs, things like Conduit coming down, things like Leech coming down for free. All that stuff is really nice. And we talked about how like the shaper cards within System Gateway kind of give you things, these goals, these like mini objectives. And DZ actually paints a pretty cool objective. Install a program once a turn. And to get your value back, that's a lot of money. And you don't want to leave that money on the table. Maybe you feel bad when you install 2 programs a turn, but you got to do what you got to do. Now in Shaper, this is quite good. Again, there's a lot of programs to install if you want to get this down in the early game. And throughout a game, it might give you 5 or 6 credits. Now on its own, that's not too bad for a 2 credit card you install. If you do end up getting 5 or 6 credits off of it, that's okay in System Gateway. That's actually probably pretty good. But hopefully you also need the additional MU so you get additional benefit. It's also worth noting this is not unique, and why I wouldn't encourage you, I don't think entirely, to install 3 of these on turn 1. If you do that, I think most of your programs are going to be next to free, which at least feels really cool. I feel like I'm getting the most value of DZMZ is actually outside of Shaper in System Gateways when I'm playing something like Lou, because Lou has a lot of things he wants to install, right? Like you have cards like Fermenter that are coming down on the cheap. You have cards like Botulus coming down, and that helps you a heck of a lot. It's also with cards like Botulus and Fermenter, all these things take up MU on top of all the other stuff you want to do, all your breakers, your leeches, your conduits. So having additional MU in that helps a heck of a lot. And we'll talk about there is another MU option within System Gateway. It doesn't cost 2 influence. It costs 0 influence. It's a neutral card. So a lot of times you're making a decision when you are building a deck and you're considering getting more MU into your deck, whether you want to play this for 2 influence outside of Shaper, or whether you want to play the neutral thing. And we'll talk about the neutral thing later. But this being an economy card on top of an MU card is kind of nice. That's actually really surprising. I think the original version of this that was spoiled to me, actually, this card came in at 1 credit. And I think on 1 credit, this card is absolutely wild. It's wild how just adding, technically doubling its cost really makes it less appealing. But I promise you, this is quite a nice card. And in System Gateway, if you get this down early, it's fantastic. I'm just not sure I'd put 3 of in a deck because I don't think you need it that soon in the game. I'd rather draw economy and stuff like that, like stronger economy, things like Creative Commission, sure gamble. Now outside of System Gateway, this is actually very interesting because the MU card that Shaper used to play and that was exported outside of Shaper pretty often, Akamatsu Memchip, rotated with System Gateway entering the standard card pool. And this was a very simple card. While there is a lot of flavor text, it's just 1 credit, 1 influence, 1 MU. And so this sort of now represents the standard of what MU looks like. It's twice as expensive, twice as much influence, but at least it does give you money, which is nice. Again, we'll talk about T400 a bit later. And this sort of ability of like installing things cheaper is actually something personally that I've very much enjoyed in a lot of decks. There's a lot of decks I used to play with Sahasrara in it, just because some of the shaper decks or out of shaper decks I like playing are things that install very consistently over and over again. And I find myself in a lot of those decks putting all 3 DZMZs and getting them up as soon as possible so we can start installing nonsense. This is maybe an okay enough explanation or example of it. This deck runs 3 DZMZs and then is installing a lot of things. It has all the MU to now get all the Rezekis in there. Maybe it's installing over and over again with things like Simulchip to get in some of their imps and installing these over and over again. It's nice. If you plan to install a lot of things, you're going to get a lot of value, and it gives you the MU to also help you hold some of the bigger things. Mind you, this doesn't have self-modifying code, which is a 2 influence card. It also works really well with Aesop's Pawn Shop decks. A lot of these Aesop Pawn Shop decks would install programs, and now installing those programs for free is a bit nicer. Admittedly, cash was like the main thing that cost money that would be big in these sort of Aesop's decks, but we'll have some other examples soon. It helps with weird things. This is Peregrine. There's a whole cast of Falcons that you need to reinstall over and over again if you want to use them to derez ice, and that's prohibitively expensive. At least with the DZMZ, you're paying half cost a lot of times, and that makes it a bit more manageable. You have cards in Shaper like Chameleon, which you want to install over and over again. This thing returns to hand back and forward, so 2 DZs means this is coming in for free. And cards like Black Orchestra too. This is, I think, something that I should have showed Aesop's Pawn Shop a bit later, but there are a lot of Shaper decks that will just play Black Orchestra. They'll install it hopefully for free with DZMZ, and then Aesop's Pawn Shop it at the end of the turn. Have this like interesting economy engine. It works really well with things like Cyber Trooper Tellude as well. These sort of economy engines are actually really fun. They're really kind of fiddly, I think, but there's a lot of these moving pieces and it feels really Shaper. The idea is that every turn I'm going to install something and then I'm going to pawn it over and over again is really good. And DZMZ really helps you there. It gives you money on install. And then that also works with other things like what's it called? A technical writer, right? Like these sort of engines that are install based. It helps a lot. And there's a lot of things you can do, I think, within Shaper. On top of that, it is 2 credits, and on its own, if you get this down early and then install a Rezeki for 1 credit, that's good. You not only do you have an ongoing Rezeki ability, not only do you have the ongoing DZMZ Optimizer ability, but now your Rezeki isn't taking up the MU that you might need for other stuff, and you're on the good way to build a Hushikon too. It's also worth noting DZMZ says once per turn, which means if you can figure out ways to install cards or programs on the corporation's turn, that counts. So maybe you're finding off simul chips on the corporation's turn to be able to install things cheaper. That's really nice. You have things like prognostic Q loop that you can also fire on the corp's turn if you're pretty confident about your deck composition. You can pay 1 credit to install a program off the top of your deck, maybe for free. And that actually can be really fun, and that adds up. We've seen a lot of really cool decks like that, Chameleon or Woobraham or whatever you like. That's awesome. I think this card's also comparable to Cyberdelia. And Cyberdelia is like a card I never liked. It's always so slow and clumsy and expensive. It's a card that you put down early, and then eventually once you get your breaker out, and then once you're breaking all the subroutines, if you are running, it'll give you the credit back in value. And while this is definitely potentially a very powerful card, I like DZMZ a bit better because it's a card that's a bit cheaper, and obviously, but also it helps you set up. And a lot of times that's the struggle in Shaper, is you have so many things to set up. This will help you get there sooner to the point where you are breaking things. And sometimes like in Shaper decks, they can kind of fall apart if they're not well oiled before the Cyberdelia is up and you're breaking things. So I appreciate that a lot. I think this is really flexible, and I'm excited to see all the sort of decks that this lines up in, because there's a lot of decks that do want to install a lot of things, and there's a lot of reasons to like continually install the same card over and over again. This helps with this sort of engines. I like this card a heck of a lot. I really want to figure out what that last Z is. All right, we have a console. This is Pantograph. It's a unique 2-credit hardware with the console subtype. It also gives you 1 MU, and it says whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, just like Tau, gain a credit. Then you may install 1 card from your grip, and of course limit 1 console per player. With this beautiful baby, I can juggle simultaneous runs by haptic feedback alone. Signed Tau. 3 influence here. This was actually the first card in System Gateway that was spoiled through like an AR puzzle. And it was pretty cool to follow that, see this card slowly be unscrambled. So what is a pantograph? It's actually cool. I'm a big fan of this art, but if you've seen what a pantograph is, it's this kind of like combination of simple machines. It's like a bunch of quadrilaterals attached together. And the idea is you see up there, it allows you to scale up images. And a lot of times it's used in drawing or even to some extent on Magic construction. And if you kind of see it here, this is a video from Shoe Rainer Drawing. I just YouTubed up. But the man here is tracing this pawn on the left. And then basically, due to the way the levers work, it draws the same thing on a smaller scale. And this sort of idea, I reckon, comes up in the idea of these Waldos. We talked about this on the DZMZ Optimizer. The idea that Tau can control a suit, that controls a suit, that controls a suit. Then eventually that sort of like movement is scaled down to such a minute level he can interact with molecules. I think that's awesome. So this is a really exciting console, a really flashy and fun console. And it's Tau's console. And for Tau, it makes a lot of sense. This triggers whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, and Tau triggers whenever an agenda is scored or stolen. So hopefully you can use these together to build up some really mean Leela-esque 1-2 punches. And when I first read this, I wasn't that impressed with it, but then that's because I was used to another unimpressive card. This was Logos, a criminal console that has just rotated, but this triggered whenever the corpse scored an agenda, and it'll let you grab a card from your deck. And I thought Pantograph would have that same sort of trigger, but it's way more flexible. It's whenever an agenda is scored or stolen. And I wish to some extent Logos said that on its own. So how do we use Pantograph? Firstly, on its own, Pantograph, you install this for 2 credits, you get 1 MU. That's fine. We've already said that that's good enough for DZMZ Optimizer. And whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, gain a credit. So let's see, throughout a game, you get this down early, you get 6 credits. Maybe, probably. That's fine. That's honestly fine. It did not need to have additional text. Obviously, it would not be a very compelling console, but on its own, that's a good enough proposition value. But now on top of it, you get way more value because you get clickless installs. And that's good. That's saving a click. And a click is often a lot of times valued at more than a credit. It's generally about a credit and a half, 2 credits. So this gives you a credit and a click. That's like 3 credits of value whenever an agenda is scored or stolen. So what do you do with it? Literally anything. The corpse scores an agenda, you install a Telework Contract clicklessly. That's fine. That's good. That's just universally going to be good. And it's really interesting. We talked about before how Shaper decks from the past really focused on this, like installing a lot of cards, that sort of efficiency. And it's cool that Pantograph does play into that while also being a very efficient card. Sorry, not an efficient card, it is, but also can be actually an aggressive card, which I like. And we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so other things to talk about. Maybe this is in scattered order. Firstly, the corp is going to be scoring agendas generally on their turn, which is a lovely way to install programs with your DZMZ optimizers to get the first program installed each turn. On the corp's turn, that's a turn, you get that credit reduction too. So it's basically like installing a program and saving 2 credits, 1 for the DZM and then 1 for the Pantograph. That's fantastic. And again, installing anything is good, installing programs is good, but then there's some really funny tricks you can do with this. When Tranquilizer is installed, it comes in with a virus counter, and at the start of your turn, it comes in with a virus counter. So if the corpse scores an agenda, you install it, and then on your turn, you get another counter. So it's on 2 counters, and basically in the next turn, it's going to suddenly de-res something. So the corp doesn't have a lot of time to react to something like Tranquilizer. And if you attach this to something like a cookbook, and admittedly now we're talking about 3 influence in every single faction so far, the idea is that if you have a cookbook and a Tranquilizer, when the corpse scores an agenda with Pantograph, you can install a cookbook Tranquilizer. So it'll come in with 2 virus counters. Then your turn starts and you have an immediate D-res. And we talked about having that D-res suddenly can be such a big deal where suddenly the big ice on R&D is de-resed and they can't afford to re-res it. And you pull in a Conduit and you just smash the game closed. There's some real scary tricks here where things coming out of nowhere means the corp can't prepare for them. Suddenly, and again, Conduit coming down out of nowhere is such a big deal. If the runner thinks or the corp thinks I'm going to score this remote server, it's okay. They just have a Pantograph, and suddenly you install a Conduit clicklessly, and then your next 4 clicks are run R&D, run R&D, run R&D, run R&D. It's wild. On top of that, you have things like Fermenter that can come down and turn sooner. Maybe we're still playing Cookbook, so this gets more money. Botulus can come down earlier, so it gets more virus counters at the start of turn. That can be pretty mean, especially now when Tau has also moved the ice that the Botulus is attached to. It is also worth noting that if you have 2 abilities that have the same trigger, so Pantograph scores when agenda is scored or stolen, and Tau triggers when agenda is scored or stolen, you choose the order that your trigger is fired. Now, if the corp scores an agenda, they have to do their when scored abilities first because it's their turn, and then they give priority to you, and then you can do all of your when scored abilities at your choice of order. So now you can do, so there's just wild pressure plays here, right? The idea is that the corporation's feeling good, they scored an agenda, while they had a white space on HQ, and you tow that white space onto R&D. Then through a combination of Pantograph and DZMZ Optimizer, you install your decoder for maybe 1 credit. You get that conduit down, and then you start smashing. Like, you just get value out of nowhere, pressure out of nowhere. I think also on top of that, like, while you can build these like cool 1-2 punch combo plays, one of my favorite things about Pantograph is that it allows you to be aggressive. We talked about how Shaper wants to play control. Shaper wants to set up sometimes, or classically, right? And Shaper wants to install a lot of things and get a lot of combos up and stuff like that. And I really enjoy the fact that you could do click 1 Pantograph, click 2 jailbreak whatever server is open. And now if you steal something, you get a credit and you install a card. So it allows you to be aggressive without sacrificing the ability to build up your board state, which is something that you inherently want to do in Shaper. I just love that. This is the first aggressive Shaper console we've seen, give or take Daredevil perhaps. And I'm such a big fan of that, that this is a reactive card that allows you to react. And it's also a card that aggressively you can put down and start poking while at the same time threatening to build your board state. We also have just the same way that I guess with Tau, it is worth noting that this can fire multiple times a turn, and that can just be ridiculous. You get down a Conduit, you start hitting multiple cards on R&D, you're now stealing agendas, so Pantograph is giving you more money for cheaper runs, maybe you're installing those things you need to install on the way, and then it just keeps, you see deeper and deeper because you've stolen agendas, so now when you run back to see 4 cards with Conduit, they're actually like new cards, right? That's so cool. I'm a big fan of this console. It's just really fun to play. It also makes something that's a bummer, the corp stealing or scoring an agenda, into something that's quite nice. And then it also gives you a good reason to try and go out of your way to steal agendas just to get those good installs and get that money back. Now, outside of System Gateway in the standard format, it's still quite nice. I think there are a couple more cards that trigger at the start of turn that if you cheat them out a bit sooner, you get to that value a bit faster. The idea is that the corp scores an agenda. Maybe you get a daily cast down. Now you're getting those credits sooner. Stuff like that's kind of nice. But it also helps, again, if you're playing Aesop's Pawn Shop, getting those cheap installs, those free installs, maybe you're installing a Harbinger, that helps you get your engine up. And we see cards like this. This is a Pantograph. It's only 1 of in the deck, and on its own, sometimes this is just, 1 MU for the deck. But the idea is that if you do get this down early, you're going to get like, I don't know, 5 or 6 good installs. And for a deck that is as complicated as this, those installs really help, let alone the 5 to 6 credits. It also threatens some sort of weird combo breaking. And while Clot isn't really a good example of this, because if the corp scores an agenda, you don't really need the Clot anymore unless they're going to score multiple agendas within the same turn, which is technically possible. It does give you the ability to react, or at least give some fear to the corporations, right? The idea is if the corporation scores an agenda, and this is technically actually valuable, well, it's not entirely valuable within System Gateway, but say the corporations just scored a 5-3 agenda and you know they're going to threaten double Neurospike. When they score the agenda, you can react and say, okay, I'm going to use my Pantograph and I'm going to install something like a Sports Hopper. So now if they do Neurospike me, I'll draw 3 and I'll be safe. Or you can install a No One Home from hand. And then suddenly, okay, well, you can go ahead and try and Neurospike me, but I have more money than you and I can trace you out. It's kind of nice. The idea is that you can keep some of your tech cards in hand, certain tech cards that you don't need to install until certain circumstances, and just keep them there. And then hope that the Pantograph will give you the time to react to the pressure to get them down on the table. And I think that's really cool. Shaper, again, the way that they build decks does often lead them to having a lot of one-ofs of different cards that are better in certain circumstances, in certain situations. And so this gives you an ability to reactively play them on certain board states. The same idea too, it's worth knowing, of course, Pantograph fires on your turn. Maybe you've run R&D, stolen tomorrow's headline, and now you have a tag, and now you can install something like a Citadel Sanctuary. So Citadel Sanctuary comes down at the end of turn and gets rid of your tag clicklessly. Like, that stuff is kind of nice. The idea that you can react to whatever you do. Say you hit any sort of like trap, you can maybe intelligently help yourself out by installing the right thing at the right time. I think my favorite thing maybe about Pantograph is the Astrolabe problem. It's worth noting that Astrolabe was the Shaper console that saw the most play. This came out in the Lunar Cycle. It's no longer legal, but this was the Shaper console that showed up in every Shaper deck for a really long time until Astrolabe rotated. No other console saw such consistent play. And after Astrolabe rotated, no other console did see play. And you'll see things like this. Like, this is a deck back from 2020, but this is very common. Shapers just wouldn't play a console. which is entirely different than Anarch and Criminal. It's very hard to find a competitive Anarch or Criminal deck that doesn't want to play a console. But for a lot of times for Shaper, they just wanted a bit more MU because the consoles themselves didn't do much. And I think Pantograph will see more play than no play. And I think it is a very compelling Shaper console. I think it's also very flexible and there's a lot of decks that can use it. Because again, it just is going to fire and just getting free installs is good enough. But on its own, at least it's one credit more than Nakamatsu Memchip. And that's it's fine. That's quite okay. So I'm excited for a Shaper console that is just broadly playable. And it's also a really fun console to play. There's a lot of opportunities for some pretty clever things, and color me excited. I think it's really cool. Again, within System Gateway, it's a lot of fun. You can build those. It like really allows you to swing into those 1-2 punches that show up out of nowhere, where the corp scores an agenda and thinks everything's going to be okay, and then suddenly it's very not okay for them. All right, we got a Shaper program. This is a virus. It's called Conduit. It costs 4 credits, taking up 1 of your MU. It says whenever a successful run on R&D ends, you may place a virus counter on this program. As a click, run R&D. If successful, access X additional cards when you breach R&D. X is equal to the number of hosted virus counters. And there's a quote that says, "A dabbling with truth is a pernicious dream. Drink deep or taste not the raw data stream." And there's some fantastic art by Liga Smilskalne. This is actually really dope art, like most of the stuff Liga does. And I don't fully know what this is. This resolution here is like quite low, but this relates from my understanding back to the sort of I Ching that we saw when it came to the card Diviner. I Ching is a sort of divination. It came from an old text called the I Ching, which is translated to the Book of Changes, the Classic of Changes. And it's a pretty old book, a Chinese book that basically teaches you or explains how somebody can kind of predict the future or see how things will change over time. The ways that they used to predict the future, some of the classical ways came to like throwing sticks and reading how the sticks lay or flipping coins, stuff like that. And this is a text that's used for divination, for philosophy, for scientific and religious studies. It's like a pretty broadly used text. And these sort of symbols here, like these outer symbols, kind of look like those grams, the shapes that came with the I Ching. I think they're hexagrams, right? And then when I started Googling some stuff, the Wen Gao or Gua shows up. It's a method of interpreting the results of the I Ching divination. I'm not actually sure the differences between this. There's a lot of ways to read the I Ching. But if you look at some of the images, these sort of like similar 8 trigrams of the I Ching show up. And these are the images you see actually around the sort of the conduit art here. There's also a hand holding a folded, I think it's a flower or is it a crane? I should have looked at the full art. This is a really low res. But this is really cool. The idea of seeing the future is actually something that is kind of very close to home with a card like this. This is a functional reprint of a card called Medium. And I love the idea of Medium too. Medium was a card that pressured R&D and solved multiple cards. But the idea of a medium being able to speak to the undead or maybe see the past or see the future, I think lines up really well with the sort of a conduit, the way to talk to the unknown or see the unknown. And that sort of divination art lines up really well. Now, Medium was like one of the strongest cards for a really long point in the time of the game. There's a lot of decks that were just, the way that I would call them is a medium delivery services. So this is an Andy deck back in the day in 2016, had some good stuff, and then eventually you'd get a medium down and try and close the game. Because medium is a card that you need to respect. The idea you run R&D, see 1 card, then 2 cards, then 3 cards, then 4 cards. If there's a medium with 4 virus counters on it, the corp has to do something. If they're not purging virus counters or somehow keeping you out of R&D, next turn you're going to run in C5, 6, 7, and the game's not going to be on for very much longer. And while Conduit works largely the exact same way as Medium, there's some like subtle differences. That exact same idea holds true specifically in System Gateway. A lot of times I'll put a Conduit in every deck I play, 2 in Shaper, 1 in Criminal and Anarch. And if you get this down, if the corporation can't make R&D expensive enough or for you to get in, or they can't defend it well enough or put enough pressure into a remote server to maybe distract you, this will win the game. Because if you're going through Rice, again, Conduit will get 1 token, Conduit will get 2 tokens, 3 tokens, 4 tokens, and the corporation has to purge. You, again, as a corporation, you can spend your whole turn. You can spend 3 clicks to purge virus counters. So you'd wipe all the virus counters off the Conduit, resetting it. But that's a really tall ask in System Gateway. Outside of System Gateway, there's a couple other ways to purge that are a bit more on value. We'll talk about those in a bit. But the idea is that as a corporation, if you can't keep them out of R&D, you can't really you can't afford to purge consistently, and this will close games more than any multi-axis in System Gateway. This is the strongest multi-axis in System Gateway. I think we talked about many times now how Tau can capitalize on that. The idea is that Tau can say like, oh, your R&D was a Pharos. Okay, well now it's a white space. Whoops, I break that for 1 credit. I'm going to put down a Conduit and close the game. And it's really hard to deal with that. It really is. The fact that Tau can consistently ensure that your worst ice is on R&D, and then those R&D accesses can snowball into a game win is a real threat. And I think a really big thing of how you have to play against Tau again is like, don't install things like white space. Maybe don't install things like Tithe. Only play your bigger, more meaningful ice, because eventually, and it's not easy to do this, mind you. Sometimes you have to, but eventually Tau will make sure that your R&D is the easiest to get into, and the Conduit will close the game. And of course, there's another thing that might not be obvious to newer players, but there's something called R&D lock that's very important to understand when you're playing Netrunner. The idea with Conduit, if I'm running R&D and I'm seeing the top 3 cards, as a runner, I know as the corporation, you won't be able to find an agenda. Off the top of your deck, maybe you mandatory draw, and then maybe if you spend your next 2 clicks doing draw, at that point, if you spend your 3rd click doing draw, you're going to see a card that I did not see with the Conduit. Now, admittedly, at that time, you're going to be discarding over cards and you haven't dealt with the Conduit problem. But the idea is that if you consistently see the top cards of the deck, the corporation can never draw into an agenda. So there's some pretty legitimate strategies in which you say, okay, I know the corporation has an agenda, the remote server. That'll be their first 2 points. I'm just going to lock the top of R&D, and then they can never win. And that's almost true. It is worth noting that in System Gateway, you do have access to things like Spin Doctor and ways to technically shuffle the deck. So before you do your mandatory draw, you could shuffle the deck. So you start to draw new cards that the runner hasn't seen. So there's a chance you can get out of that lock and find some agendas, but admittedly, you've also just shuffled R&D. So if the runner runs back next turn to see 4 cards, because they have some Conduit counters, they're going to be 4 new cards, as opposed to sometimes like 3 old cards and 1 new card if you didn't draw on your turn. So that you have to keep that in mind when you're playing, that this sort of pressure not only will find agendas quickly, but also can stop you from drawing agendas, which will stop you from having a chance of winning the game. On top of that too, this is a good way to find agendas when you need them, so you can ensure Tau is going to fire. Maybe again, you can't get into the remote server because it has a Pharos on there. Go ahead and run R&D and then maybe put the Pharos on R&D for a minute until you stabilize. Yeah, you'll get rid of that thing later, right? Now we talked about how this card is different than Medium. And I think there's a big deal here. Medium was just, there's no click abilities on it. Medium, whenever you ran, got a virus counter, and then the virus counter saw more cards. But Conduit's a lot less generous. In theory, you always get the virus counters, but if you want to see multiple cards from running R&D, you actually have to click Conduit. And that means you can't Conduit at the same time as playing Overclock, because both of those actions require a click to initiate a run. So you can't tread lightly and Conduit at the same time. And for Medium, you could, and there was actually obviously a big strength of Medium. You could do good run events while pressuring Medium. And Conduit, in theory, you can still like Overclock to get the Conduit counter and then run back later to see the additional cards. But it definitely is a bit weaker on that front. And System Gateway also, it's a card I'm definitely going to be playing in my Xayah deck. I think I played it on one of every deck just because it is the strongest pressure. But also in Xayah, it's fantastic because Xayah wants to see as many cards as she can on a run to get the most of her ability. And this is the one card in System Gateway that can be like, oh, gain 5 credits. Admittedly, if you're seeing 5 with Conduit, I don't think the game's going to be that much longer, but obviously it's quite good. And that's Conduit. It is the threat. I feel I have no doubt a lot of System Gateway decks or games end with a Conduit coming down and so much pressure going on that the corporation just is going to be in a hard spot. And there are ways to deal with it, right? Like it's not going to be easy. Maybe, you know, you can put some defensive upgrades on R&D that can slow the runner down for sure. Anoetic Void is also obviously very good, but it's something you have to respect. It's also something you have to remember to purge. There's a lot of games in System Gateway where the Conduit gets to 3 or 4 counters, and then maybe the corp puts another ice that the runner can't deal with, and the corporation forgets to purge virus counters because they start getting more preoccupied with scoring out their next agendas. And then in 4 to 5 turns, the runner runs R&D and sees 4 cards. So when the Conduit gets up to 2 or 3 counters, you need to consider purging because having to run an R&D to C4 is probably going to be a problem. So do keep that in mind. And if you play the Conduit and the corp loses some turns, that's good on its own, right? Having the corp lose turns is nice. Now, outside of System Gateway, This is an R&D pressure card, and there's a couple R&D pressure cards that a lot of decks are deciding what works best for them. I think Conduit is quite strong. You're seeing other decks run Stargate, which is a bit, it's obviously different. It takes a more MU. It's a stronger, more disruptive ability, but is only once per turn. While Conduit can say like, oh, R&D is open, I'm going to try and win in 1 or 2 turns. But there's a lot of decks that want to decide whether they want to play Conduit for 4 influence or Stargate for 3 influence. That's a bit different in faction. You also do see things like Turning Wheel, and that's quite cute as well. And they also work well together. But a lot of times, a lot of decks in the standard format are going to be running a single Conduit, a single Stargate, and then figuring out how to get to their win condition, which is eventually putting that thing down and putting enough pressure. It also works really well. This is a lad deck that is an Apocalypse list. And we talked about Apocalypse being quite strong. But the idea is that when they wipe the board, a lot of these decks will, after that, put down a Conduit or a Stargate to close the game. Because if the Corp has no ice, they can't stop the Conduit. And that's going to be a problem. Yeah, things are interacting very similarly to how Medium did back in the day. Medium, again, was very strong. And a lot of decks would just get to the point where they deliver a Medium to close the game. But I think there is a big difference right now as opposed to some of those Medium lists. Firstly, Cyberdeck Sandbox is alive and well. This is a neutral agenda, so just about every corp can choose and will choose to play this, and it basically allows them to purge virus counters, clearing your Conduit, and at the same time making money. So the purge action is actually not as bad for them by a mile compared to if they just had to purge and nothing else happened. On top of that, you're seeing other ice, things like Macrophage, you think things like Cyberdeck's Fire Suite. These are support cards that make it very difficult to rely on viruses. Having to Conduit through a 7 strength 4 subroutine Macrophage is next to impossible. So a lot of times it's not the best way to do things. On top of that, Medium back in the day was actually really strong when it was attached to things like ice destruction. So Parasite was one of the best ways to destroy ice in the Anarch card pool. And if there's no ice on R&D, it was a lot easier to get in there and get free accesses and build up those Medium tokens. And it's a lot harder modernly to destroy ice. There's not that many options. So while that is something that you might want to consider with a Conduit deck or even a Stargate deck, it's just not as easy as it used to be before, where you could clear the way and then smash in with a Medium. That being said, we're seeing Conduit do some really cool things, and I think we've talked about this a couple times before so far in these review series. This Hivemind Max deck that came from Pincel and the players in the NWE play group is just so cool to watch how it works. Basically, this deck spends 4 influence on a Conduit, and the basic idea is that this deck will have a Hivemind, a 5 influence virus that says the virus counters on the Hivemind are considered to be on every other program installed or every other virus installed. So the idea is that they get a Hivemind with 4 or 5 counters on it and then suddenly install a Conduit and run R&D, and it's a huge problem. So Conduit is doing work on the competitive level. It's a really good inclusion in decks like this, but you're seeing most other Anarch decks, I think, go closer to Stargate, but for Shaper, this is really good. You spend no influence on it. And I think on Criminal, you could probably go either way. Maybe the Stargate's a bit easier, albeit obviously the MU is a bit different. It's also really cool to finally see strong R&D pressure in Shaper. It was wild, the idea that one of the best R&D cards, Medium, was an Anarch card, when Shaper was meant to be the faction that cared about exerting R&D pressure. And while indexing does represent some of the strongest R&D pressure in the game, it's not in the standard card pool. It's really nice to see that come back home to Shaper, and I'm a big fan of that. Again, Conduit, it's good. It wins games. Put one at least in every System Gateway deck, and if you get this down, the Corp has to respect it. If they don't, they will lose. All right, we have another program. This is Echelon. This costs 3 credits to install, also takes up a single MU, and it's a killer. So that means generally it breaks Sentry subroutines. And it says this program gets +1 strength for each installed icebreaker, including this one. Interface, so it will break 1 Sentry subroutine for 1 credit as long as its strength is equal or above the sentries trying to break subroutines. And then you have to pay 3 credits for 2 strength. The beauty of open projects, each stands atop past success. So this thing is 0 strength, 1 influence. 1 influence is pretty easy to import. And while it is technically 0 strength, it'll always be at least 1 strength because this program strength does count itself as an installed icebreaker. So it's a 1 strength program. Now, in terms of the name, Echelon references a secret government codename surveillance project. I don't think that's entirely it, albeit those are satellites. But also the name Echelon does technically refer to people working together in a group in a disciplined or organized manner. And it looks like these are like multiple satellites working together in some sort of way. So that's cool. Now, we talked about Shaper wanting to set up and install a lot of cards and build for that late game inevitability. And this is one of the cards within System Gateway that is that honors that old tried and true Shaper way. The idea is that Echelon on its own, when you install it, is kind of rubbish. You're spending a lot of money to deal with sentries. 3 credits for 2 strength is awful. If you want to get this on turn 2 up to like a 4 strength sentry, you're spending 6 credits just to boost, right? That's not good. So the idea is that you want to install other icebreakers to ensure that this gets up to strength. And that actually works really well with cards like DZMZ, as we talked about before. The idea is that if you want to install one thing a turn to ensure that Echelon eventually gets there, this helps a heck of a lot. And it's very common that at the end of your System Gateway deck that you'll have at least 3 icebreakers installed. You'll have 1 killer, 1 decoder, and 1 fractor, and that's where you're trying to get to. So hopefully by that time, Echelon will be a 3 strength killer that breaks 1 Sentry Subroutine for 1 credit. Now, System Gateway doesn't have a lot of options for programs or for icebreakers, right? There's 2 killers within System Gateway. Your choices are either Echelon for 3 and Carmen for usually 3. And they actually have kind of similar numbers. They both break a subroutine for 1 credit. Carmen boosts a bit better, 2 for 3 strength, while this is 3 for 2 strength. So your big choice is what is better at dealing with the sentries in System Gateway for how much influence. And there's 4 sentries in System Gateway. The one behind my head is Tithe, which we can largely ignore because they deal with both of them for the same cost. But if you're looking at these sentries, they start at 3 or 4 strength. And that's actually a bit awkward for both of them, right? 4 strength is technically fine for Carmen. You're going to spend 2 credits to get to that strength and a 1 per subroutine. But if you have 3 installed programs to get to 4 strength, you have to boost this always by 3. So unless you install a 4th icebreaker, a redundant icebreaker, you can install 2 echelons, mind you, they're not unique. You could get this up to 4 strength. And when you have 4 icebreakers installed, Echelon will almost always, always will be better than Carmen. But in most cases before that, Echelon's actually a lot more expensive. Carmen will boost once to deal with all the sentries, and Echelon has to boost once or sometimes even twice, which is quite expensive, especially in the early to mid game when you don't have all those icebreakers installed. So for that reason, Echelon's a bit awkward. I feel like in a Shaper deck, I'll often play Carmen and then maybe play 1 Echelon that you install later in the game once you have everything working your way. The idea of installing an Echelon, and actually that's maybe a nice way to get 4 programs installed, or icebreakers installed, right? Is to have a Carmen and an Echelon. But if you install this in the early game and you need to get through like a ballista, it is going to be really unfortunate for you. So it's really interesting that works the Shaper way, that you have to set up to get there, but maybe on the way you play other cards like Mayfly or whatever, so that, you're not blown out before you get that up to speed. It's also totally worth knowing that Leech, just like it is very good with Carmen, is very good with Echelon. And I love Leech. Again, we talked about Leech being good in Tau because Tau can sometimes get free runs on HQ and archives where the corp doesn't want to ice them up. So the idea is that Echelon, that once Leech subroutine or Leech, counter can sometimes be worth up to 3 credits, which is a lot of value. It's also technically worth knowing that Tau can move the sentries around. So if you're not good at dealing with sentries, because Echelon isn't great in the early game, sometimes you can use Tau's ability to reposition the sentries to a point where you don't need to deal with them. Ideally, you'd want to be able to deal with everything well, and maybe putting in a Carmen will help you get there, but it is worth knowing that Tau does have some built-in ease to getting up to speed. And that's Echelon. I think it is worse than Carmen until you're late game, and then it's a bit better than Carmen. So I think you want to build your deck around that sort of idea. Outside of System Gateway, again, it's not probably going to see any play, and that's totally fine. It is worth noting that like killers are meant to be the weak point of Shapers. Not every faction is meant to be good at breaking every single kind of ice. So it's quite okay that the killer in Shaper is not that great, because a lot of times those sort of decks will maybe consider spending influence, bringing a better killer, maybe a criminal killer, into their Shaper deck. Now in a standard card pool, we've seen Nanotech. This hasn't seen a lot of play, but this is also a very good killer for the late game when the corp maybe has a lot of ice on our server. You can deal with that pretty cheaply. But modernly, you're seeing more a combination of things like Ika, which is cheap to install, but is expensive and very technically positional. And you combine this with Ngolo a lot of the times. And Ngolo on its own is a very good decoder and gives you the ability to deal with a sentry, without having to install another program. And that's more often than not what you're seeing in competitive shaper lists is Ika and Golo combination. And a lot of times you don't actually need to install the Ika if things are going correctly. And I think that's a big thing. Again, this is going to come up a heck of a lot when we talk about some of the icebreakers within System Gateway, or specifically the shaper ones, is again, the standard meta is pretty fast. Again, this deck runs only 3 sentries, so there's not a lot of sentries compared to some of the other ice, but it's a lot of times these decks are going quite quickly, and you don't have the time to install your Echelon, install a bunch of other programs on top of it. We're having things like just, I installed an Ngolo, I'm good. That is a lot more favorable than a card that needs a lot more support to get spun up. If the meta slows down, maybe this could be a consideration. Again, a 4 strength sentry, a killer that breaks 1-for-1 subroutine is actually pretty good. It's just it's gonna take you a while to get up to speed. Maybe those Pantograph triggers will get there a bit faster. A very similar card. This is Unity, 3 credits and 1 MU for this icebreaker decoder. Interface, same idea. If you're equal or higher strength of the ice you're interacting with, pay a credit to break the code gate subroutine. And then you can spend a credit to give this +1 strength for each installed icebreaker, including this one. And the flavor text says, the joy of handcrafted code, each fits perfectly within the whole. Comes in for 2 influence, 1 strength. So this is another art by Liga. If you haven't seen at this point, Nisei's done a really cool job where they'll oftentimes commission an artist to do a lot of the art for a certain faction. So Liga has done, I think, all the programs, right, in Shaper. And Liga's been doing Netrunner art for a really long time. There's actually 75 pieces right now in Netrunner that Liga's done. And Liga has this amazing art style. It's a lot of people's favorite throughout Netrunner, really prolific Netrunner artist. And Nisei on their YouTube channel, they actually have an interview. They did this artist colony stream back in April 10th. And a section of this, they interview Liga and they talk about building this Unity art. And you actually see like the SketchUp drafts of the 3D engines. And you actually see this is not the final product. You'll get to that at some point here. But you see the sort of intricacies here that might not be that obvious on the card. I think Liga even says what the actual art spec was asked of her, and it's to deal with the idea of hypercubes. There's meant to be some like Chinese dragon motifs in there and some like Chinese gears and like metal work. There's like some really fine and interesting designs that might not be that obvious. You see these sort of like dragon toothed gears. I think those are so cool. That's one of my favorite arts in the whole set, and Liga is absolutely fantastic. I think Liga also right now is doing more stuff for like Magic the Gathering and even some Keyforge. So shout out to Liga. So similar idea. It's an icebreaker that gets better the more other icebreakers you got installed. On its own, coming in for 3, it's 1 for 1 strength. And once you get a second icebreaker in there, you're paying 1 for 2 strength and so on and so forth. So this scales, I think, a bit better than what's it called, an Echelon, because a lot of times you're not going to spend 3 credits to boost. And that's quite nice. Again, it works with everything else here. With DZMZ, you want to install a lot of things. You want to get your Unity, your Echelon down, and the whole party's here. Now, again, there's not a lot to talk about when it comes to icebreakers within System Gateway because they just generally have strength and subroutines. They have some additional like interesting stuff, this whole like strength boosting thing. But if you look at the 2 decoders, you got Buzzsaw, which is 3 strength and really shouldn't be boosting its own strength and gives you 1 for 2 code gate subroutines. That's amazing. And then you have Unity that requires some support. But once it does have support, it can deal with the high strength code gates relatively well. Now, the problem with System Gateway is that there's really nothing that is high strength. Buzzsaw breaks Diviner for 1. It breaks White Space for 1. And Funhouse, if you have a Leech token, you break it for 1. But a lot of times you can go through Funhouse without requiring a breaker. Again, I'm a big proponent of just go take the tags. And that's kind of the issue when it comes with the Unity compared to Buzzsaw, is in the System Gateway meta where all the ice falls within that 3 strengths Buzzsaw limit. I just don't see why I'd ever play Unity. Buzzsaw is also only 1 influence, so it's not hard to import this into your Shaper deck. I just don't think I'd ever build a System Gateway deck that does have Unity in it, because the benefits of Unity are only very obvious once you've installed a lot of things and once you're breaking really high strength code gates. The fact that Unity can deal with like 5 strength code gates relatively well in the late game is really cool. But the problem is that that just doesn't exist within System Gateway. So I'm not even going to consider it. Now, outside of System Gateway, again, that gets a bit more relevant because we start seeing ice that is of higher strength. Engram Flush is really annoying to deal with. And how many programs or icebreakers do you need installed for this to break that for very cheaply? You need 4 icebreakers installed, that and 3 others. It's kind of a tall ask, but the idea that you can break eventually an engram flush for 3 credits is like, I guess it's okay. There's some high strength code gates. Gatekeeper comes in at 6, at least for 1 turn. And I think even in the article that talked about Unity, the designers talked about, oh, it's one of the best ways to deal with Fairchild 3.0. And it technically is true. The idea that in the late game, Unity is one of the best things to deal with ice like this. Like you could break this for 4 credits, which is pretty wild considering this is one of the most taxing pieces of ice in the game. We've seen this sort of thing before. I think we showed Study Guide before. It is a decoder that in the mid game, in the late game, once you get enough support, kind of similar to how Unity wants you to install everything that you see, it deals with Fairchild for really cheaply. And the same idea that if you want to build your own Baba Yaga monster, eventually you'll get through all the ice in the world for pennies. But the reality of it is right now in the modern meta, and it's been this way for a while, is the game is just a bit faster than that, where you really struggle to get Baba Yaga down and strap a whole bunch of things on it. Or it was actually not that hard to get Study Guide up to strength. Stimhack is a hell of a drug. But the idea is that the meta is a bit fast. We're having to deal with 7 code gates in this list, and most of them require you to get your Unity down and then a bunch of other things just to be able to boost up the strength. It's just not going to work for you that well within the standard card pool as compared to some of the other options. So that's a bit of a bummer. Again, this is like a competitive list, and I'm aware that a lot of people are playing. This is worth mentioning. Like a lot of people who play the standard card pool aren't playing competitive Netrunner just because standard, I don't even know if this is true anymore, classically was the biggest format. Mind you, startup is a really cool format to play casually, even competitively, I guess. Yeah, it's worth noting against some of the best decks in the standard format. I don't think you have the time to get the value from this. And even if you do, it's not as good as some of the other options. But that's Unity. I don't know. I don't have that much to say about it. The art's fantastic, but in System Gateway, it doesn't make sense. And outside of it, it doesn't make sense. But it's really cool on theme for Shaper. Install a lot of stuff. Okay, this is our last Shaper card. This is Telework Contract for 1. This resource is coming down as a job subtype. When you install this, you'll load 9 credits onto it. When it's empty, trash it. Mind you, load means it comes from the bank, so you're going to be making money. And then you click to take 3 credits from this resource, but you can only use this ability once per turn. For all I know, I could spend a shift digging next to old Wayland himself, says Lane. 2 influence, not too bad. So this is a really funny card. You see that there's some workers on top of him, and I think they're actually sitting on couches on the low res image, working and operating these like giant mining machines. And these machines are on the moon, and they're probably digging up the old Helium-3. Mind you, Melange Mining Corporation is one of the old Netrunner cards, and it talks about this operation on Highline where we're digging up HE3, a very valuable resource that I believe is used for what is it used for? Fusion, for energy generation. So it looks like on the side, your shapers have a job where they're spending their time to make money operating these giant digging machines, and I reckon these machines are very, very giant. But if you want to see them small, this is a really fun kind of shout outs. This is Regolith Mining License. It's a corporation asset that makes them money. And you actually see these like corporation operatives, and you see that they have their representation. These are the mining drones that the corps and the shapers are basically working the same job, which is fantastic. So this is a Telework Contract. You can click 3 credits off of it. Installs for 1 is really easy and really cheap. It's a nice card to get out of your hand quickly. And that is the exact same idea. Once per turn, you want to go to work. You want to go to your job. It's the exact same idea that shows up with so many of the Shaper cards that gives you these small goals. This turn, go to work. Install a card with DZMZ. At the end of your turn, go on vacation. And it's awesome. Not only is this awesome because it's a cheap card to get on the table, so it gets out of your hand quickly, so you can VRcation at the end of the turn. I just love that the Shaper playstyle is thoughtful. It wants you to plan your turn, and it gives you a bunch of these like mini objectives to hit on your way. On its own, you install this for 1, and then you spend 3 more clicks to gain 9 credits off of it. So you're spending 4 clicks to gain 8 credits. And that's honestly pretty good. That's on average a click for 2 credits, which is a fair bit better than clicking for 1 credit. And if you compare it to things like liberated accounts, which comes in for 6, which is sometimes expensive and clumsy, you can spend, 5 clicks to gain 10 credits off liberated. So it's technically comparable. You technically get less money. 8 is less than 10. But one of the bigger deals is that liberated accounts, a lot of times runners will hit them multiple times a turn. And you generally need to when you spend 6 credits on a liberated accounts. There's not that many board states unless you're very far ahead that you can just be like, I'm going to click this once, or I'm not going to click this, because that 6 credit hit is a big deficit that the corp can capitalize on. But spending 1 for the telework and not even hitting it the same turn isn't the worst hit. Like it isn't the worst for you. And that's actually worth noting. If you install your telework, you generally want to at least have a click to hit it the same turn to take the 3 credits off of it. Otherwise, it's going to be another turn before you can milk all the value from the mines. On the first time what is it? So you spend 1 and spend 2 clicks and to gain 2 credits. Yeah, so the first time you use this, it's 2 clicks for 2 credits. It's like not the worst. It's not amazing, but this only gets better. I like it. It's a very easy shaper resource econ card. And this is also very different than some of the shaper cards we've seen before. We've been talking about cards like professional contracts that take setup and a lot of time to get value out of, things like a technical writer, that's an econ card that wants you to install a lot of things. And this is just such an easy card to play. You get it down and you're going to take 3 credits off it for the next 3 turns, hopefully. And that's it. The only thought is to make sure you have another click in it, but like it's simple. It's really easy to play. I'm enjoying this. And I think this helps build that sort of like good stuff, operation-based shaper deck that has this fuel in the tank, which is very different than some of the shaper decks we've seen so far. I will actually end up splashing this card a lot in other decks within System Gateway. In my Zaya decks, yeah, I'll maybe spend 2 influence on one of these. I think you have some choices whether you want to play Creative Commission for 2 influence or a Telework Contract at the same cost. And I find a lot of times I'll actually rather play Wildcat Strike for 1 influence to get that sort of burst econ like Creative Commission, and then spend 2 influence on something that won't give me as much of a burst, but will give me more value over time. I like that a fair bit, and it gives you some choices. I think it's just good. It's good. In System Gateway, it's good enough. It's strong enough econ. Again, it's not unique. You could play multiple of these, but then you're spending half your turn in the mines, which, you know, you have a lot of other things that are competing with your time. But yeah, that's good enough. 4 clicks for 8 credits is quite okay. Outside of this, outside of System Gateway, mind you, in Standard, there's some other cool things you can do with it. Mind you, when there's 3 credits left on this, instead of clicking it, you can always pawn it to the pawn shop, which is nice. Again, a lot of ASOP pawn shop decks are still quite good. And you're seeing this just show up again as something, it's a very easy include, the same way Daily Casts shows up in a lot of competitive decks. This will just be 2 Telework Contract in the deck, and I'll click it when I need to. And it'll give me the money to set up and continue to put a bit of pressure. It's also because it's not a late, like, it's true that you do have to commit to it for a couple turns. It's a very easy thing to set up. And this is an Apocalypse lat deck, so it doesn't want like that sort of board that you're going to invest a lot of money building up because you're just going to destroy yourself with an Apocalypse. So similarly to how Armitage code busting was back in the day, Telework Contract works well in this. You don't even have to clear all of this out and you don't waste too much value. And again, it kind of puts a clock on the corporation. Every turn that they're clicking 3, you kind of have to do something. On top of that, this sort of works really well with the Creative Commission VRcation decks that we talked about, these sort of Onicom decks. Because a lot of time the Onicom decks want to only play 1 event a turn to ensure that Onicom value. And this gives you a resource that you can also spend your time on to continue that sort of engine. And there's technically a whole deck that you can build of these once per turn values. Like I'm going to hit my LLDS, or not LLDS, my DZMZ. I'm going to use this. I'm going to do this. It's really nice that you can make a deck that gives you all these like sub goals to do and you want to scratch them all off. Finally, always worth noting, a Telework Contract is a job. So Az can install it for free. There's not a lot of jobs in the game anymore. That's a huge bummer for Az, but it's Telework Contract. It's not a very flashy card. I don't know out of faction if people are going to spend 2 influence on this. I think Liberated Counts is also 2 influence. And sometimes this doesn't show up that often. I think maybe more often if this is going to show out of faction, this will show up maybe in the mini factions. Things like Adam is pretty good because Adam does want to get cards out of their hand in the early game when they want to set up and get their free card draw going. And that's a really nice way to do it. But on its own, a 2 influence econ card that's playable in just about any deck is really exciting to see. Especially that it is like easy econ and shaper is so cool. That's all the shaper cards. That's 9 cards we went through. We have 2 more neutrals we're going to get through after this. And as a recap, just to talk about all the shaper cards, I'm actually a really big fan. We talked about how this is like really different than what shaper looks like outside of System Gateway, where we're talking about like a sort of toolboxy decks. The idea is the decks that can interact mid runs to pull things out of their deck. Things like self-modified code, simul-chip. Like this sort of like very creative, flexible play. I don't think that is as obvious with these sort of cards. the idea of having the best tools for the situation, maybe that does exist to some extent with Echelon and Unity once they're spun up to speed. But again, I don't think that matters so much because I think that's a very tricky thing to build into a new player experience. Having a lot of cards that say sort through your whole deck, pull out the right thing while using the timing window in a way that might not be obvious to newer players just doesn't line up well. So I'm not upset about that at all. I think it's really cool how the designers at Nisei went away from this sort of like wild, explosive creativity and they made more, it looks like they lean more into shape for thoughtfulness. The idea that the shapers are planning their turns, which mind you is just a good thing to do in Netrunner anyways. I like that these cards encourage you to plan your turns out and again, hit all those little mini objectives. On top of it, we talked about this before, but just like the cards like Creative Commission, even to some extent Telework Contract, but mostly Creative Commission representing like clean, simple economy, similar to what Anarch and Criminal have had for such a long time now, and I guess Neutral as well, is going to be a really big deal to designing Shaper decks because Shaper decks were largely pigeonholed to these sort of slow, resource-based, very install-heavy engines. And I'm really excited to see if those sort of cards can breathe new life into entirely new play patterns in these green cards. Also, Tau is just such a fun ability. I love Disruption. Disruption's so fun. I want to be annoying all the time as a runner. It's for the run, huh? So we got 2 more neutral cards, and honestly, in retrospect, maybe this is a bummer to talk about it after DZMZ, but I feel like we have to talk about this one. This is T400 Memory Diamond. It costs 2 credits. It's fully neutral. It's a chip subtype. That technically does matter for a certain card. +1 MU, and it says you get +1 maximum hand size. So it's a neutral chip that gives you that MU and then the hand size. It says LLDS still holds the patent, but good tech attracts knockoffs, which is such a funny line. LLDS is a reference. There's a couple cards in Netrunner that were LLDS something, and specifically LLDS Memory Diamond is a very similar card to T400. It was a card that gave you MU. It also gave you Link, which isn't something present in System Gateway, and also increased your maximum hand size. And it's awesome because this is a minor knockoff from the T400 brand to LLDS. But a bigger thing is LLDS. This stood for, or stands for, Lucas Litzinger and Damon Stone. These were the original designers, or the designer and the former designer. Damon was working with Lucas. I should know his exact title. I'll correct it on the bottom. But these were the designers of Netrunner when it was rebooted as Android Netrunner in 2012, which is really funny. As a reference to Nisei talking about how they are the Nisei, the second generation. Good tech attracts knockoffs. So, hey, that's, I think, absolutely fantastic. So neutral hardware giving you MU. It's been a weird design space that has technically exists, but hasn't seen a lot of play. We've seen things like Q Coherence chip, cheap MU, but has a huge drawback. And Dyson Mem chip has been around for a bit. No longer either of these cards are either of these cards in the standard card pool. This also gave you Link and MU for 3 credits. And the value of MU actually really differs based off of which runner faction you're talking about. Not every faction has the same access to MU. So neutral MU kind of like irons out that space, right? So if you look at Shaper, and mind you, apologies, we're going to be talking outside of System Gateway first. We used to have access to Akamatsu, which is a really cheap and simple option. If you wanted to import this for one influence, you could. And in Shaper, you'd play cards like Akamatsu and even sometimes things like Net Chip to make sure that you can get some of those bigger programs installed without taking up your MU. Now, modernly, if I'm building a Shaper deck, and specifically in System Gateway, I don't see why I'd play T400 because I have access to DZMZ. And obviously here you're trading off 1 additional hand size for actual credits on reducing your install costs. And we talked about how the Shaper card pool wants to install a lot of programs, and I value econ in this game way more than hand size. There are very few situations where that additional hand size has mattered as much as not having that last 2 or 3 credits you need to get into the remote server to win or lose the game. So I don't think those are very equal trade-offs. And again, T400 is meant to be a neutral card, so it's meant to be, while a bit more approachable, not as strong usually. So if I'm playing Shaper, I'll generally be playing DZMZ if I need the MU within System Gateway. Now again, outside of System Gateway, Anarch could use the MU, but they have a lot of consoles that do give them additional MU and a lot of MU. Knobcurie for +3 is really good. Now you can only use that stuff for viruses, and they do have additional virus MU support. And a lot of times you're not going to see Anarchlists spend influence for additional MU. A lot of times their console will just go far enough. So sort of neutral cards like this, I don't know if they'll ever see play within Anarch decks. And Criminal's actually the most interesting because Criminals has no cards. There's no criminal cards ever printed that give Criminals MU outside of their console, which is wild. And, you know, Criminals actually have a reason why they could want more MU in their decks. There's a lot of things within the standard card pool that you want to install a lot of stuff, even just within System Gateway. You want to get all your breakers down. On top of that, you want to play a Leech probably because Carmen is pretty expensive with you want to boost. And on top of that, you want to deal with Tranquilizers. Maybe you want to get those on the table. Maybe you're also playing Conduit for multi-access and Botulus. Like there is a reason why an aggressive criminal might want a lot more MU than just the one MU that their Penny Shaver gives them. But again, then it becomes a big trade-off of do you want DZMZ or do you want the neutral card? And a lot of times that just comes to how much influence you have. And at the end of the day, this is technically a way to save 2 MU. 2 influence, if it comes to that. But I think the big issue here is that the hand size within System Gateway is not that relevant. And this is a pretty bad tempo play, as it's called. The idea is that the game is only going to be so many turns. And so every click that you want to do, it wants you to push yourself closer to your winning condition. And paying 2 credits just to give you an additional MU, which you might not need now, but you might need in the future. An additional hand size, which technically could matter, so you don't have to discard a card. But you're not discarding a random card again when you're discarding at the end of your turn. You're discarding your 6th or 7th worst card. So that's not that much value generally. I don't think, at least. That gets a bit different. Like sometimes there are decks that exist that will run multiple cards that you need to keep in hand because they're part of a combo. Something as simple as like Emergency Shutdown and Forged Activation Orders. These are criminal cards that work really well together. Maybe having additional hand size could help you build in some ridiculous combos where you can put off some cool pressures and do something cool. But that doesn't exist within System Gateway. So I think a lot of times I'd rather just not play MU if I'm not playing DZMZ Optimizer. It just feels really bad. 2 credits to do something that doesn't impact the board meaningfully this turn, probably won't impact it for a while, is not amazing. Sorry if I'm a bit harsh on that. It's a neutral card and it's not very flashy, but it's the same way that Dyson Mem chip only showed up in decks that needed the link, because this is one of the easiest way to get the link, and 3 credits for 1 MU is not going to cut it. Now, on top of that, there are some reasons where 6 hand size can matter. It's totally true. There are some reasons. Firstly, VRcation, we talked about this. It does get a bit easier to play last click if you don't have to discard everything again. I don't think discarding cards is the worst thing, but I think the bigger things are cards like Neurospike. Very often the combo is the Corporal Score 5/3 agenda and do Neurospike into Neurospike. And that's actually really hard to interact with if you're a criminal or you're a shaper who might not have access to cards like Carnivore, a console that can perhaps trash that Neurospike before it gets you. Now, admittedly, the best way to deal with that a lot of times is to steal the agenda, but that might not be obvious. It might not be obvious it is an agenda. So in theory, having the 6th hand size and having multiple cards in hand, your full 6th hand size, means that you won't die to the double Neurospike. Admittedly, though, it'll still be pretty bad for you. So I think there's some reasons that maybe if you keep finding yourself dying to Neurospike, or maybe you just need one more turn against the Clearinghouse, you could consider putting down that T400 memory diamond for the hand size. But I think most of the time I would say DZMZ or bust, just because this is a slow card and doesn't do too much for you. DZ just gives you money too. It's good. You get this down early. It's an econ card, and throughout the game, it might give you 4 or 5 credits. I don't know. Hand size doesn't do it for me. Now, outside of System Gateway, there are technically there are just more options. And again, we talked about how most factions outside of Criminal have better options of what they can use to put more MU down. And it's worth noting that Criminals are kind of starved for MU in some circumstances. Some Criminal decks will be playing Rizekis. That takes up your MU pretty quickly. Maybe an Ngolo, that's 2 MU. And then that actually stops them from playing some cards that they might consider playing. Cards like Sneak Door Beta get pretty difficult when you don't have the MU for it. So I think there might be a reason, but it's still kind of really hard in the standard format that is pretty quick, pretty fast moving, to spend, again, a click and 2 credits on something that doesn't do too much right now. Again, same reasons though, 6 hand size can get around things like Punitive Counterstrike. If they hit you 2 punitives after you steal a 5/3, you can survive. And sometimes also just having bigger hand size just helps you steal things. But it's like a very minor ability. And we've seen a couple other cards that help you with hand size. And I guess maybe if anything, like Adam, who sometimes starts with what is it called? Safety first, a directive that starts them with smaller hand size. Like you could consider playing something like that to get bigger hand size quicker. so that you're getting free card draw with safety first. Like that is an option, but mostly all the hand size cards that we've seen so far have been incredibly niche because there's no deck that really needs a combo that requires 6 hand, unlike Precision Design, right? Anyways, that's T400. I'm not a big fan. Now this is our final card. This is Mayfly. It costs 1 credit. It's a neutral AI icebreaker for 2 MU. It takes a lot of MU. Maybe you need your T400s. It can break any subroutine for a credit. It doesn't care if it's a code gate. It doesn't care if it's a sentry or a barrier. And it says, when this run ends, trash this program. 1 credit for 1 strength. And it says compiling even the smallest AI takes weeks for only seconds of runtime. But that brief shining moment allows everything. Comes at 1 strength, no influence, fully neutral. And again, we have talked about this card a bit, actually a fair bit. This is one of the cards that was given to us from the nice people at Nisei to reveal during Spoilers Week. And this was given alongside some criminal cards like Zaya. So there's going to be a video that should be linked above me if you want to hear more of my thoughts about that. We do go into depth. I'm going to try and keep this one a bit closer. I know we're at the end of already a pretty long video. But this is Mayfly. And it is a neutral solution to deal with any kind of ice. And that is actually really valuable within System Gateway. A lot of times the corporation will, in an early game, maybe want to score an agenda behind things like a palisade and a white space. And the idea that you need to find your decoder, install it, your fractor, install it, and then get through all that stuff in the early game, corps feel pretty safe jamming an agenda behind 2 pieces of ice. Even sometimes just 1 piece of ice looks good. And the fact that you can just knock down a Mayfly for 1 credit and charge, let alone sometimes overclock or even tread lightly, just throws that entirely on its head. And Mayfly only gets 1 shot, 1 use if you want to use it. And again, sometimes you could run into the remote server and they could res, I don't know, a palisade, and you could decide not to use it. Again, it's only if you break the subroutines. But that ability to be able to pressure a remote server with a single card is so immense. We talked about cards like Inside Job being a huge part of the criminal flavor. The ability to like bypass and deal with a lot of ice in the early game with only like 1 card is it's really potent, and it puts a lot of fear into the corporation and slows them down. And Mayfly represents that. It's really hard to score out against an opponent that just has enough money and a single Mayfly. A lot of times as a corporation, you're forced to start bluffing and putting things into a remote server that might look like agendas, but aren't agendas. Maybe you install Advanced Clearinghouse or an Urtica Cipher so that they go for it and spend their Mayfly. Another really good thing about Mayfly too is that it's a safety net. If you get this down, you can start running. And if you run into like an on-sell 1.0 and you don't, or you can't, or you don't want to click through it, you can always use your Mayfly in a panic. And it's that sort of safety valve that allows you to aggressively face check in System Gateway and not be afraid of too much. That being said, there isn't too much you should be afraid of in System Gateway. The ice is not that bad, but that's the sort of idea. And if you know what the ice is because you're running aggressively, maybe that gives you a better idea of what to tranquilize or what to botulus. And I think that's absolutely fantastic. It is important though how you play with this too. A lot of times I will specifically only use this for remote servers. And it's true that you could get down a Mayfly in the early game and throw out something like a jailbreak, and that might connect in the early game if the corporation is scoring agendas. And that's fair. But I feel like a lot of the times that the corporation has 2 ice on a remote server, I'd rather be running that and potentially bringing down a regolith mining before the corporation can get too much value off of it, or of course stealing an agenda. But yeah, again, those are my fast thoughts when it comes to System Gateway. It's a really potent card in the early game. In the mid to late game, it might not matter that much. At that point, your economy is probably good. Mind you, this is an expensive card. Dealing with unsell is a lot of money. And sometimes you might just let this fire because it saves you like 6 credits. But before you find all your breakers, this will help you and ensure that you're not just left in the dust. And again, stealing those agendas is really important in System Gateway. It's like off-world office. You can't let the corp get 7 credits and 2 points. Go get it. You can find it. Now, outside of System Gateway, this actually gets a lot more interesting. And I think we mentioned in the video that we talked about how this was a bit strange compared to other criminal cards. Because if I had a criminal deck and I needed to put something in the deck to give me that early pressure, I would play something like an Inside Job or modally something like Boomerang. You also do have access to like things like Botulus if you're playing Anarch. So you do have that ability to be like, I don't have breakers, but I want to check the remote. Botulus run. Even like the bin breakers can be pretty easy when you just throw them out and not need them. But I think the place that this shines is the reason why we're talking about it now is that it shines in Shaper decks. We've seen this deck, I think it was the deck list of the week a while ago, but this is Doomrats the Flies Have It, and there's some really cool interactions here with Mayfly and Cabanessa Wu. Firstly, Cabanessa Wu lets you spend a click and no credits to bring your Mayfly out on the table. And at the end of the turn, it will be removed from the game if it hasn't been trashed, or if it's still installed. But the Mayfly on its own will trash itself if you're using it. So the Cabanessa ability won't end up being relevant and you won't be permanently losing your Mayflies. And there's some really cool ways that this works together. The idea is that you can get your Mayfly on the Flameout, a card that gives you 7 credits of value here. And the idea is that your Mayfly is going to be trashed anyways, so you're not worried about the program flaming out on its own. So you get all this additional value. On top of that, then your Mayflies go into the bin if they're being trashed by Flameout, so you can always pull them back with Simulchip or cards like Compile. And you start getting this deck that can pressure any server for very cheaply if it's set up with things like Flameout, with just single Mayfly. And sure, there are some ice that deals with AI and makes AI a bit awkward, but that goes really far, and especially when this deck knows when and where to run with cards like Falsified Credentials. And I think this deck is a really good example of how Shaper can, I wouldn't say abuse, but use Mayfly to its best extent. Things like Political Operative also help a lot with those remote server upgrades. It's fantastic. And again, Mayfly on its own, if you're just playing it in your standard like deck without any support, I don't think it goes that far. Like as soon as you're hitting something like a Nancy, you end up spending 7 credits, and that's so much. And so I really think that you need the support. The ice in standard is pretty big. So cards like Flameout do help you a heck of a lot. We also did see this in other interesting lists. This is Algebraic's 6th and 18th Mummy Longlegs. And this is Sunny LeBeau, one of the mini factions. And Sunny also does take some time to spin up. Her security nexus comes down for 8 credits. And first, she generally needs to establish an economy to be able to afford these traces. And the idea is that you have Mayflies for the early game. The Corp can't jam out early before Sunny sets up. And Sunny, mind you, is seen as a slower runner because you have access to the Mayflies. And on top of that, sometimes those work with security chips, which is really nice. It is worth noting you do have some other weird niche cards in the format, cards like Lean and Mean and Pushing the Envelope, that might help you deal with the strength of Mayfly, which is its big weakness. Mind you, 1 strength is pretty terrible. And it is also such a bummer that Cyber Trooper Tilute doesn't deal with AI icebreakers, because you'd love to have the Mayfly come in at 3 strength if you could. And kind of similar to some of the other cards we talked about today, just having that flexible answer that Atom or Apex can play, an icebreaker that isn't by any means awful. Obviously, there's a lot of strong conditions attached to it. 2MU is a lot, and it's very expensive to use. But if Apex doesn't care that his programs are permanent, or programs are permanent, go ahead and wipe the board with your Apocalypse. Like that's awesome. And that's Mayfly. Again, I think it's quite the strong Shaper card, and within System Gateway, it's something you have to respect. Out of nowhere, the runner can pay 1 credit or 0 with DZMZ, and they're going to get into that server with an Overclock or a Tread Lightly, and that's hard to play around. You need a bluff. Maybe you need some upgrades, right? Anoetics or some Managarms. Those are quite good. But those are the System Gateway Shaper cards and some neutrals. Where's our slate with everything? Again, those are all the runners. We've gone through every single runner card, if I'm not mistaken. We still have the Wayland cards to go through. But again, I'm actually a really big fan of the Shaper cards. And this is something we also said about the Jinteki stuff. I think the game opens up entirely once you just add 1 or 2 new cards to the sort of pool. And that's a really cool thing when it comes to the startup format. Startup format, mind you, is this format between standard and System Gateway, which is all of the Nisei cards. So then you do get access to things like self-modifying code and Simulchip. And then you can start playing a sort of Shaper, pulling out the right answers for any solution. Wait, the right solution for any problem? Yeah, that's more like it. And that is absolutely the most fun. And it gives you the mixture of this sort of like thoughtful Shaper setup and shapeable planning, and then that like live during the run, joy of the run, creative problem solving. And I think that's both really great. That's Tau and 9 cards. If there's any things that you think we missed the mark on, any combinations that you're excited to play with, do let me know in the comment section. Do let me know in the comment section. We read all that and respond to as much as we can. Otherwise, we do have the Wayland cards left to come up, so we'll have that in 1 or 2 weeks. These do take me a while to put together. We do stream on this channel at 8:45 Eastern on Thursdays. Hopefully you can drop by or enjoy the VOD, hopefully. And if you like this sort of video, if you want to leave a like or subscribe to the channel, that does greatly help us grow. But that's it. We should be streaming on Thursdays, and otherwise we'll be back with our final Wayland cards in just a bit. Thanks for watching. Ciao.